If you've ever felt judged by another parent for giving your kid the wrong snack, buckle up. You're about to enter Victorian Britain, the era where parenting wasn't just a responsibility, it was a moral performance, a full theatrical production, a long-running show where your audience was the entire neighbourhood, the church congregation, your extended family, Queen Victoria's portrait on the wall, and possibly a passing chimney sweep who wasn't even supposed to be watching but absolutely was. Welcome to the 19th century, where the good news is you had a baby. The bad news, everyone expected you to raise a tiny adult wearing microscopic boots of responsibility. Hello travellers, histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Victorian parents believed childhood was a brief, mildly inconvenient waiting room before adulthood. The modern idea that kids need emotional support, gentle guidance, or a childhood had not yet been invented. If anything, the Victorians considered childhood a sort of moral obstacle course, one where the child was expected to dodge temptation, behave impeccably, and sit still long enough to impress visiting relatives who secretly hated children. And the best part, parents received no helpful guidance whatsoever. Absolutely none. Not from doctors, not from books, not from their neighbours, unless you count advice like, instill discipline early or face eternal doom, which was roughly the Victorian equivalent of today's, have you tried essential oils? Victorian child-rearing philosophy was a swirling stew of religion, social pressure, fear of moral collapse, and whatever Dr. Somebody in London claimed in a pamphlet he wrote after one stressful afternoon observing his nephew. Scientific research was still in the early stages of guess and pray, and psychology was a newborn concept, ironically, one that received more emotional support than actual Victorian children. Yet expectations were sky high. If your baby cried, that was a sign of moral weakness. If your toddler laughed too loudly, clearly they were destined for ruin. If your child showed imagination, oh no, chaos. Society seemed convinced that a child's behaviour reflected the parent's virtue, and one tantrum could bring social disgrace faster than a misplaced dessert fork at dinner. Victorian parenting wasn't about nurturing, it was about upholding the empire one stern expression at a time. Imagine being a Victorian mother. It's 1864. You've birthed a small, wiggly creature who has no idea what the British Empire even is, and already people are whispering opinions about whether your child's posture hints at future criminal tendencies. You can barely blink without someone offering philosophical judgments disguised as advice. A neighbour could knock on your door at 7 a.m, peer at your newborn, and say something like, "Ah, yes, clearly a child who must not be coddled." Then she'd leave, never explaining what that meant. Meanwhile, you're left holding a confused potato in a lace bonnet. Fathers didn't get off easy either. Society expected them to lead the household with iron moral authority, which was tricky because many Victorian fathers spent more time reading newspapers than interacting with their own offspring. Parenting was part performance, part guesswork, part hoping. No one noticed you had absolutely no idea what you were doing. And then there was the moral panic. Oh, the moral panic. Victorians believed the world was constantly on the verge of collapse, thanks to misbehaviour, slouching, too much laughter, insufficient laughter, improper use of spoons, books that were too exciting, socks that suggested rebellious tendencies, and anything French. Children were seen as lovable but suspicious creatures, like kittens with access to matches. One wrong influence and boom, your household had produced a future pickpocket, poet or worse, a person with opinions. This pressure trickled into every aspect of daily life. Parents were advised, sometimes subtly, sometimes through 800-page manuals written by men who had never met an actual child, that maintaining the moral purity of their children was their most essential duty. Fun was always suspect, curiosity was monitored like criminal activity, and emotions were treated the way we treat raccoons. Interesting from a distance, but dangerous if unleashed indoors. Victorian society loved the idea of the perfect family, Serene mother, stoic father, obedient children, all posing stiffly for a photograph that required them to stand still for far longer than any actual human child has ever willingly stood still. Those staged images became the parenting ideal. The fact that real children behaved nothing like this didn't matter. The illusion was what counted. But the strangest part of all, Victorians believed their parenting methods were scientific. They truly thought they were modern, enlightened and rational. Meanwhile, their understanding of childhood development came from three sources: religious sermons, personal opinion, and whatever idea sounded the most terrifying. Basically, parenting in Victorian Britain was 50% performance, 40% panic, and 10% prayer. As you explore each chapter in this series, from bizarre feeding advice to clothing rules that sound like fashion-based punishments, remember one thing: Victorian parents weren't cruel for the sake of cruelty. They were doing their best in a world that had given them impossible expectations and deeply questionable instructions. And thus begins the journey through Victorian parenting, the era when raising a child wasn't just difficult. It was a moral marathon designed by people who had never actually met a toddler. If you've ever walked into a modern baby store and thought, why are infants treated like tiny celebrities with their own curated lifestyle aesthetic? Congratulations, you're not Victorian. Because in the 19th century, babies were not the centre of the household. They were not the priority. They were not even fully regarded as separate individuals. In Victorian Britain, babies ranked somewhere between decorative pillows and the umbrella stand in terms of daily attention. Not unloved, just not considered real people yet. To the Victorian mind, a newborn had all the personality of damp bread dough and was expected to behave accordingly. Their ideal infant was quiet, pale, and generally motionless unless engaged in some type of moral development, which, to be clear, Victorians believed began at approximately 3 days old. The phrase "seen but not heard" wasn't directed at children in general. It was practically the national anthem of the nursery. Victorian homes loved decoration, elaborate drapes, crowded mantels, and wallpaper patterns that could cause dizziness. Babies, conveniently soft and small, were aesthetic accessories to be displayed but not interacted with too much. They were like the home's newest fragile object, just with the added risk of crying loudly enough to upset the wallpaper. When guests arrived, a baby might be brought out the way people today bring out a rare collectible, gently, reverently, and with everyone pretending they know what they're looking at. Visitors would remark on the baby's complexion, which always had to be fine, or their calm demeanour, which meant the nurse bribed them with something 5 minutes earlier, and then the infant would be whisked away again before it dared do anything shocking, such as make noise or have an opinion. Victorians weren't the type to gather in a circle cooing over a child. No one leaned in to say, "Oh, look at the little pumpkin." Instead, they nodded solemnly, as if inspecting a piece of furniture that might or might not fit the room's colour scheme. The nursery was not a place parents visited often. In many homes, especially middle and upper-class households, the nursery functioned like a tiny foreign nation somewhere upstairs. It had its own hierarchy, the nanny ruled with absolute power, its own routines, and its own climate, typically chilly, because Victorians feared stuffy rooms more than Arctic temperatures. Parents did not hang out in the nursery. That was unheard of. The nursery was for children and servants, kept deliberately far from adult living spaces. A baby's daily life was largely invisible to the people who biologically created it. This separation wasn't because parents were cruel, it was because Victorian society believed constant parental presence could ruin a child morally. Too much affection, spoiled, too much attention, corrupted, too much visibility, absolutely not. What would the neighbours think? Victorians valued quiet the way modern parents value naps, with desperation and devotion. A quiet baby was a good baby, which created a kind of moral scoreboard that mothers were expected to win. If your newborn was calm and expressionless, congratulations. Everyone assumed you were doing something right, even though no one knew what that something was. Noise, however, was a threat. Crying suggested weakness, chaos, or even worse, parental incompetence. A crying baby could single-handedly ruin a social visit. A crying baby on a train? Unforgivable. A crying baby in church? That was practically a public scandal. This led to an unspoken rule. If the baby must make noise, let it happen in the nursery where no respectable adult had to witness it. The goal wasn't to meet the child's needs. It was to preserve the illusion that infants were naturally serene and morally neutral beings who politely waited for adulthood to begin. Victorians didn't expect babies to smile. Smiling suggested personality, and personality suggested individuality, and individuality suggested the possibility of rebellion, which was far too much character development for a child who couldn't yet sit up. Babies were supposed to behave with a kind of stoic blankness, like little philosophers contemplating the meaning of existence. If your baby giggled too much, family members might worry you were encouraging liveliness, a trait considered delightfully dangerous. The modern idea that babies have emotional needs didn't exist. A baby's inner life was not a topic of interest. If they had thoughts, Victorians weren't sure they wanted to know them. While silent babies blended into the household decor, crying babies became the Victorian equivalent of a fire alarm. Everyone leapt into action, mostly to remove the baby from any respectable area as quickly as possible. Not to soothe it, that was the nanny's job, but to relocate it before it damaged the family reputation. Crying revealed the baby as a creature with needs, which was honestly more vulnerability than Victorian society was prepared for. The infant was promptly banished upstairs where it could cry in morally appropriate isolation. Ultimately, Victorians saw infants as not yet humans, small beings who would eventually become moral adults, but were currently in the mysterious potato stage of development. They were cherished but distantly, loved but quietly, acknowledged but strategically kept out of the way. A baby's primary role in the household wasn't to be nurtured. It was to exist politely until it could finally stand, speak, and start contributing to the empire. If you've ever been told don't spoil the baby, you've heard the faint echo of Victorian Britain whispering through time. Except the Victorians didn't just warn against spoiling. Oh no, they acted like parental affection was a slippery slope leading straight to the collapse of civilization. Welcome to the era where holding your baby was considered a radical, dangerous act, and cuddling was seen as a gateway drug to moral ruin. Victorian parenting experts, most of whom were middle-aged men who had never even held a baby, insisted that affection was the quickest way to manufacture a weak, needy, emotionally unstable adult. In their opinions, a baby held too often would grow into a person who expected love and comfort, which was apparently catastrophic. Affection, careful, that might cause emotions. Victorian books on infant care read like they were written by people studying a skittish wild animal from across the room. They recommended minimal touching, minimal carrying, minimal eye contact, minimal acknowledgement of the child's existence. Basically, parenting as a form of polite neglect. Touch was believed to encourage dependency, a trait deeply unfashionable in a society where independence and stoicism were valued above all else. If a mother held her baby too much, critics warned, she would cultivate a clingy disposition, which they considered one step away from moral failure. Some manuals even claimed babies learned to manipulate parents through crying, a bold accusation against a creature that didn't yet know what its own feet were. Victorians believed that life itself was a harsh battlefield, and that the sooner children toughened up, the better. Holding a baby meant shielding them from hardship, which was, in Victorian logic, equivalent to sabotaging their future. Militant advice givers insisted that newborns needed to learn fortitude. How does a 2-month-old learn fortitude? Through strategic coldness, apparently. You don't cradle them. You don't soothe them. You let them cry and discover the natural world's indifference. It was the emotional equivalent of dropping your infant into a philosophy lecture on existential despair. A Victorian mother might have desperately wanted to hold her crying child, but society was clear. Affection builds softness, and softness builds ruin. You didn't want to send your child into the world as a fragile creature who expected kindness. That was simply unrealistic. The booming Victorian publishing industry produced dozens of parenting manuals, some practical, many deeply questionable, and all absolutely convinced they were correct. These books formed a chorus of confident, authoritative voices reminding mothers, do not rock the baby, do not pick up the baby when it fusses, do not let the baby think you are available, do not allow warmth or softness to become a habit, do not, under any circumstances, give affection too freely. Some manuals framed comfort as a slippery slope. Hold the child once and soon you'll be trapped. The baby will command attention, and the household will descend into emotional anarchy. If a child cried at night, one widely circulated recommendation was to ignore the disturbance entirely. Another suggested placing the crib deliberately far from the mother's room so she wouldn't be tempted to soothe the child. Tempted, as if responding to crying was a moral failing equivalent to stealing silverware. Victorians had an astonishing confidence in the health benefits of crying, specifically when a baby's did it alone, in an empty room, where no one could accidentally offer comfort. Crying was seen as a kind of respiratory workout. Manuals described it as beneficial exercise for the lungs, an opportunity for strengthening the constitution, a wholesome test of resolve, in modern terms. This is the equivalent of treating a baby's meltdown like a fitness routine. Victorian babies weren't crying, they were doing cardio. The idea that crying might signal distress, discomfort, hunger, or fear, irrelevant. The crying wasn't a problem, the mother's instinct to comfort was the problem. Victorian culture believed emotional closeness created fragility. If a child grew accustomed to comfort, how would they survive the adult world? They might expect kindness. They might expect empathy. They might even expect love. Unacceptable. So emotional distance became a parenting strategy. Parents were encouraged to maintain a cool, reserved demeanour. A baby was to be handled, not embraced, attended to, not soothed, acknowledged, not doted on. The underlying message: if you want a strong adult, deny your baby warmth. Even with these impossible standards, society turned around and blamed mothers when children displayed signs of attachment. If a child reached for their mother too eagerly, it was said she had been overly indulgent. If a toddler cried for comfort, it was considered evidence of maternal weakness. Victorian mothers lived in a world where their natural instincts were framed as moral hazards. They were warned that affection was the root of future disobedience, and so many suppressed the urge to hold their own babies simply to avoid criticism. Meanwhile, fathers rarely faced this scrutiny because, let's be honest, most didn't spend enough time with infants to be accused of excessive affection. Behind closed doors, some Victorian parents cuddled their babies anyway. They rocked them, soothed them, and held them tenderly, in defiance of every rulebook and judgmental neighbour. But they did so with guilt, secrecy, and a sense that they were committing a minor scandal. Affection became a rebellious act, a whispered softness in a world terrified of tenderness. The "don't hold your baby" movement wasn't born from cruelty. It came from fear. Fear that love might weaken, fear that softness might corrupt, fear that a child's future depended on suppressing early comfort. It was a system built on anxiety enforced by manuals, neighbours, and society at large. A world where babies were expected to tough it out from day one, and where a mother's arms were considered the most dangerous place a child could rest. If you've ever seen two modern parents argue over whether organic baby puree is superior to mashed bananas, rest assured the Victorians would consider that discussion laughably simple. Their feeding advice wasn't just contradictory, it was practically Victorian performance art. A dramatic spectacle starring porridge, panic, and pudding served at completely inappropriate times. Victorian babies weren't just fed, they were initiated into a culinary obstacle course, often before they could even hold their own heads up. Feeding, like everything else in the 19th century, was a moral issue, a class issue, a medical issue, and a matter of intense public judgment. And the more improbable the dietary expectation, the more confident Victorians were about it. Victorian parenting manuals insisted that babies needed precise, regimented feeding schedules, not flexible routines, not hunger cues, not anything resembling common sense. No, the ideal Victorian infant ate according to the clock, not according to the inconvenient reality of being alive. Manuals sternly warned, feed only at specific hours, never adjust the timing even if the baby is shrieking like a foghorn. Do not give snacks between meals, hunger cries, disregard as a test of parental fortitude. Victorians approached feeding like a military operation. If the schedule said feed at 2 p.m, then by 1:59 that bottle better be warming, and by 2:01 failure had already occurred. Babies didn't get to have feelings about this. Victorians believed that indulging a baby's hunger outside scheduled hours was the first step toward raising a future glutton, a fate almost as dire as raising a child who smiled too often. Victorian advice on when to wean a baby varied wildly, depending on which book you were unfortunate enough to read. Some sources gave weaning timelines that made sense. Others gave timelines that suggested the authors had only a vague understanding of how babies work. Some doctors insisted babies should be weaned shockingly early, sometimes as early as 3 or 4 months. Others recommended waiting until a full year, describing anything earlier as a reckless invitation to digestive disaster. A few ambitious writers suggested babies could thrive on solid food at a surprisingly premature age, which is Victorian for, we have no idea but give it a shot. Weaning advice was like Victorian weather, unpredictable, confusing, and often based on superstition rather than science. Modern parents debate sugar, salt, and processed snacks. Victorians debated whether babies should ever consume fruit without parental supervision. Some foods were treated like dangerous contraband. Apples were believed to cause stomach rebellion. Citrus was too exciting for a baby's delicate temperament. Fresh vegetables were suspicious unless boiled into unrecognizable mush. Eggs were considered morally questionable for reasons never fully explained. Bread was approved only if it was stale, dry, and as thrilling as chewing cardboard. The Victorians feared anything too flavourful, too stimulating, or too interesting, which made baby diets resemble prison rations more than children's meals. Victorians loved a good substitute. Why give a baby something normal when you could give them something questionable? Some of the strangest items recommended for infants included water thickened with flour, arrowroot paste, the official taste of disappointment, bone broth given to children far too young to digest it, invalid jelly, a wobbling mass whose primary ingredient was confusion beef tea, which was not tea, not appetizing, and barely beef. These substitutes were often praised as fortifying and strengthening us, or ideal for tender constitutions. If anyone questioned the taste, texture, or actual nutritional value, Victorian doctors responded with the scientific equivalent of, "Don't worry about it." Here is where Victorian baby feeding truly goes off the rails. Victorians believed babies should eat pudding very early, much earlier than any modern paediatrician would allow. Manuals recommended rice pudding, bread pudding, tapioca pudding, pudding made of boiled milk, and whatever else was lying around. Why pudding? Because Victorians considered soft, sweet, bland foods to be the ideal moral middle ground. Not too indulgent, not too harsh, just the right combination of mushy and morally neutral. There are records of babies under 6 months being fed pudding in the belief that it would settle the stomach. It probably did the opposite of settling, but the Victorians had confidence so strong it could shatter thermometers. Victorians had a remarkable talent for taking something simple, feeding a baby, and turning it into a multi-step moral journey. Meal rules included: always feed the baby in a quiet room to avoid excitement. Never allow the child to express preference. Preferences indicated future disobedience. Encourage the baby to finish what is offered, even if what was offered looked like wallpaper paste. Never let a baby eat too quickly, too slowly, too eagerly, or too joyfully. Basically, feeding time was less about nourishment and more about shaping a future citizen who would eat with the emotional neutrality of a stone. A baby who fed well was considered proof of maternal competence. A baby who ate unpredictably was considered a sign that the mother lacked discipline, structure, or sufficient moral authority over the household porridge pot. The stakes were absurdly high, not because of nutrition, the Victorians barely understood vitamins, but because feeding was symbolic. A baby's appetite represented the mother's virtue. If the child refused food, people whispered. If the child ate too enthusiastically, people whispered louder. Victorian feeding advice wasn't the product of scientific research, it was a cocktail of superstition, class expectations, personal opinion, and dietary theories so experimental they should have come with warning labels. And through it all, Victorian babies somehow survived, despite being fed like tiny soldiers training for a future career in Stoic pudding consumption. If Victorian parents ever hoped for clarity in child rearing, the Cradle debate quickly dashed those dreams by proving that even the simple act of rocking a baby could ignite a philosophical war. Imagine being a new parent, exhausted, confused, and searching for advice, only to discover that half the experts insisted rocking would doom your child to a lifetime of spinal weakness, while the other half assured you that failing to rock them would cause irreversible brain sluggishness. It was the Victorian version of asking the internet for advice, only with far more lace and far less logic. Victorian households were filled with cradles, wooden, ornate, lovingly carved, and often about as comfortable as a shoebox, but no one could agree on what to do with them. Should they move gently? Should they remain rigid? Should they sway, swing, rock, glide, or sit entirely still like a solemn piece of nursery furniture? Every parenting manual seemed determined to present its own theory as the universal truth, which meant parents ricocheted between panic, guilt, and resignation depending on which book they read before breakfast. One camp firmly believed that rocking was practically a gateway to physical collapse. They wrote confidently that every soft sway was a treacherous invitation for the child's spine to turn into moral and physical jelly. They warned that babies lulled too frequently would become weak, helpless sleepers, unable to face the world with the necessary Victorian steeliness. To them, the cradle was a temptation, a wicked wooden contraption that encouraged softness. And softness, in their worldview, was just one slippery slope away from complete social ruin. Another camp, however, was convinced that motion was the salvation of the infant mind. These authors declared that babies deprived of gentle movement would grow up sluggish, dull, or even melancholic. They insisted that rocking stimulated healthy brain activity, soothed anxieties, and nurtured an inward calm, essentially describing the benefits of motion like they were prescribing a philosophical spa treatment. According to this group, an unmoving cradle was the problem. A stationary baby was a bored baby, and a bored baby was a future disappointment. The contradiction created a remarkable dilemma. Rock the baby and you risked being accused of coddling them into spinal weakness. Don't rock the baby and you risked raising a child with a lazy brain. No matter what you chose, there was always some doctor ready to warn that you were steering your child toward disaster. Victorian parents essentially lived in a state of cradle-based paranoia, tiptoeing around the nursery as though the slightest nudge might permanently alter their baby's destiny. The arguments extended into astonishing detail. Some manuals insisted that rocking was acceptable as long as it was not too vigorous, a concept that raised more questions than it answered. How vigorous was too vigorous? No one agreed. Some advised that rocking should only be done in short intervals, preferably at specific times of day, ideally after a meal but never just before sleep. Others said rocking was fine before sleep but catastrophic afterward. A few warned that children rocked excessively might become addicted to motion, a concept that conjures images of toddlers demanding their morning sway like tiny adrenaline enthusiasts. Parents who leaned toward the no-rocking philosophy invested in cradles that resembled miniature beds with stiff legs and zero mobility. These cradles were intentionally rigid, like tiny wooden monuments to self-restraint. They advertised strength, stillness, and the noble endurance of babyhood. The child would lie there motionless as though preparing for a future career in maintaining perfect posture at social gatherings. Parents who believed in motion, meanwhile, embraced cradles designed to sway with elegance and purpose. They chose curved runners, gentle arcs, and cradle frames that could swing with just a fingertip's touch. These parents proudly displayed their rocking cradles as evidence of their commitment to intellectual development, convinced each soft sway was encouraging their baby's mental brilliance. Their household sounded like gentle metronomes, the rhythmic creak of wood echoing through quiet hallways. What made the cradle debate especially delightful or maddening was the sense of absolute confidence expressed by each side. Both groups behaved as though the fate of the British Empire rested upon the trajectory of cradle motion. Rocking too much or too little wasn't just a parenting choice. It was a moral and intellectual stance. Every movement of the cradle symbolized either strength or weakness, discipline or indulgence, the triumph of logic or the downfall of reason. Caught in the middle were parents who simply wanted their babies to sleep. They were probably the quiet heroes of the era, individuals who ignored the manuals, trusted instinct, and rocked their babies because it worked. But if these parents admitted this publicly, they risked raising eyebrows from neighbours who had memorised every pamphlet ever printed about the dangers of rhythmic swaying. Some parents attempted compromises. They rocked occasionally, but only at specific angles. They allowed motion but banned rocking at night. They swayed gently but avoided anything resembling a full arc. Their cradles were half rockers, half statues, pieces of furniture that did the bare minimum of both philosophies without fully committing to either. In the end, the cradle debate was never truly solved. Victorian society thrived on dramatic contradictions, and cradle advice became yet another arena where panic disguised itself as expertise. What mattered most wasn't whether the cradle rocked, slid, or stood perfectly still. What mattered was appearing to choose the correct method, whatever that happened to be that season, so society would applaud your moral fortitude. Now that we've explored the cradle chaos, the next chapter will unravel an entirely different kind of Victorian parenting confusion. For your next chapter, you can move on to the icy anxiety of cold water upbringing, or venture into the obsession with ventilation, or perhaps explore why Victorian children slept in rooms colder than a forgotten root cellar. Victorian Britain loved two things with absolute unshakable devotion: moral discipline and being slightly miserable for the sake of self-improvement. Nowhere did these two passions collide more dramatically than in the national obsession with cold water. To the Victorian mind, cold baths weren't just hygienic. They weren't just invigorating. They were an all-purpose, character-building, soul-fortifying ritual that promised to turn even the most delicate infant into a citizen of iron will. Because nothing says healthy childhood like turning your toddler into a popsicle. This wasn't the gentle, refreshing splash type of cold bath you might imagine. There was no pleasant summer breeze, no playful dripping of water between tiny toes. Victorian cold baths were the kind of icy shock that made adults reconsider their life choices, and they were given to babies. Infants who couldn't yet speak were suddenly plunged into water that could wake the dead, all in the name of discipline. Not hygiene, not fun, discipline. Victorian manuals described cold bathing with the same confidence and optimism we reserve for miracle cures today. They promised it improved circulation, strengthened the constitution, prevented idleness, sharpened the mind, boosted appetites, cured tantrums, and encouraged a properly tempered spirit. A single dip in icy water was supposedly capable of solving everything from fussiness to vague moral weakness. If a baby cried, the authors interpreted this as proof the treatment was working. No Victorian ever met a discomfort they didn't try to repurpose into a virtue. There was a belief that cold water hardened children. Physically, mentally, morally. The colder the better. Warm water, on the other hand, was viewed with suspicion. Warm baths were indulgent, luxurious, and potentially corrupting. If you bathed a child in water that was actually comfortable, who knew what depravity might follow? Perhaps they'd develop opinions, Perhaps they'd enjoy life. Absolutely unacceptable. Many parents followed this belief with religious zeal. They began the day by dunking their babies into cold water as casually as one might dip a biscuit into tea. The practice wasn't about cleansing dirt. The water was often too cold to allow much washing. It was about toning the nerves, which is a polite Victorian phrase for "good luck, child, you're on your own." Parents who questioned the ritual were swiftly reprimanded by medical authorities of the time, who insisted that anything other than cold water was weak and effeminate. So mothers stood trembling beside the wash basin, lowering their wailing infants into Arctic temperatures, all while anxiously hoping they were building character instead of regrets. One can imagine the scene: a nursery just barely warmed by a small fire, a tin basin filled with water that looked like it would rather be ice, and a wide-eyed child whose expression said, "This family clearly hates me." Victorian babies learned early that life was not warm, comfortable, or easy, lessons delivered through the medium of full-body goosebumps. Cold water therapy extended far beyond the daily bath. If a child misbehaved, parents occasionally used cold water as correction. A brief splash on the face, character building. A quick dunk of the feet, restorative. A sudden pour of cold water down the back, moral realignment. It was a disciplinary toolkit disguised as a wellness routine. And the advice wasn't limited to the wealthy. Working-class families followed suit, even without the ornate washstands and porcelain bowls of upper-class nurseries. A bucket of cold water by the back door did the trick just as well. Whether you lived in a manicured townhouse or a cramped row house, everyone had access to Britain's cheapest parenting tool, the national climate. Some manuals even suggested bathing children outdoors to maximise the benefits. Fresh air plus cold water was considered the ultimate recipe for health. Never mind that Britain's outdoor temperature was often one stiff breeze away from hypothermia. The combination was believed to toughen children into miniature Stoics, prepared for a world that rarely smiled back. The ritual became so entrenched that many adults swore by it long after childhood. They credited their own endurance, health, and stoicism to those icy dips. Of course, they also conveniently ignored the fact that many other people survived childhood without needing to reenact the Arctic every morning. Despite the enthusiasm, not everyone was convinced. Some Victorian doctors warned that cold baths could shock the system, weaken already frail children, or cause illness. But their voices were drowned out by the chorus of moralists who believed warmth was dangerous and comfort was suspicious. If a child enjoyed the bath, something must have gone wrong. The belief system was so strong that mothers often felt pressure to hide any hesitation. If they admitted they preferred warm water, they risked being whispered about. "She coddles her child," neighbours might murmur. "Next thing you know, the child will have..." And so the ritual endured. Not because it was pleasant, not because it made sense, but because it aligned with the Victorian worldview. Life is harsh, childhood is training for hardship, and a little shock to the system is good for the soul. Cold water became the unofficial mascot of Victorian parenting. Bracing, unforgiving, and always ready to remind children that comfort was optional. For your next chapter, you can move into the era's complicated battle over fresh air and drafts, explore the Victorian terror of warm rooms, or dive into how emotional expression was treated like a contagious illness, whichever direction you want your story to flow next. Victorian Britain had a complicated relationship with air. Not breathing, everyone agreed that was necessary, but the invisible mystery swirling around them. To the Victorian mind, fresh air was either the purest form of life-giving medicine, or a deadly assassin creeping in through cracks in the window. And the great pregnacing irony of the era was that many believed both at the exact same time. This left Victorian parents in a permanent state of ventilation-based confusion. Should they fling open every window to let in invigorating breezes that cleanse the spirit? Or should they seal the house tighter than a submarine to prevent a cold draft from murdering their child in their sleep? Parenting books provided no clarity, because half advocated for maximum airflow, while the other half insisted that even the faintest whisper of moving air could trigger instant catastrophe. Parenting advice has gone off the rails when two experts recommend solutions that physically cannot coexist. Victorian homes became battlegrounds of airflow philosophy. One parent might open every window the moment the sun rose, convinced that fresh air cured everything from restlessness to disobedience. The other parent, likely armed with a different manual, would then rush around slamming the windows shut as if the house itself were under attack from breeze-born demons. Somewhere in the middle was the child, wondering why every draft was treated like a supernatural event. The fear of drafts. Oh, drafts. Victorians treated drafts the way modern horror films treat cursed objects. Fascinating, mysterious, and guaranteed to bring doom. A draft was the villain of countless medical warnings. Doctors claimed it caused colds, fevers, neuritis, nervous disorders, moral decline, and possibly even loss of fortitude, which was Victorian for your child might not grow up to glare heroically into the distance. If a child sneezed, many parents immediately blamed a draft, even if the child had just eaten handfuls of dirt outside. But while drafts were death incarnate, fresh air was somehow the opposite. Open, moving, outdoor air, good. Indoor, sneaky, invisible air currents, bad. The distinction was never explained in a way that made sense. Imagine trying to visualize the difference. One breeze is a benevolent guardian of health, the other is a cold-blooded assassin plotting to sabotage the family. You can practically hear Victorian parents whispering to their children, "Not that wind, darling, the safe wind," so bedrooms became carefully managed microclimates. Some manuals insisted that children must sleep with windows wide open all year round to build robustness. If a child shivered, this was seen as a sign of progress. They were acclimating, even if their toes were turning the colour of Victorian wallpaper paste. Other manuals argued that children must be shielded from nighttime air at all costs. With windows locked, seams sealed, and curtains weighed down like the wind itself was trying to break in with malicious intent. This contradiction led families to invent complicated, almost acrobatic solutions. A parent might open the window for beneficial circulation, while simultaneously draping the child's bed in enough heavy fabric to protect them from fatal nighttime drafts. Some parents positioned the cradle directly in the path of fresh air, but erected elaborate barriers, blankets, chairs, screens, to stop the movement of that same air from actually touching the child. It was ventilation by approximation. One typical recommendation went something like, air the room well, but be certain no air moves, which is roughly the equivalent of a cooking book saying, bake the pie thoroughly, but do not expose it to heat. Another manual insisted, let the child inhale fresh current from the window, yet avoid the child being struck by such current. This instruction paints a vivid picture of parents performing window gymnastics, trying to direct airflow, like Victorian traffic police. The funniest part is that many families believed both theories simultaneously. They would declare fresh air essential, then panic if a breeze touched the back of the child's neck. They wanted their babies strong and healthy, but not so strong that they experienced air movement unsupervised. The result was a parenting style built on perpetual contradiction and a vague hope that the child might absorb the correct form of air by luck alone. The obsession went beyond bedrooms. Children were marched outdoors daily, even in miserable weather, because fresh air was considered medicinal. But if the wind picked up, immediate retreat, a gentle breeze, encouraging. The same breeze 10 minutes later, treacherous. Parents watched the sky like meteorologists fueled by anxiety. Even prams were designed with complicated hoods and screens to allow air in while deflecting dangerous drafts, making Victorian baby carriages look like mobile fortresses designed to house a diplomat, not a 6-month-old. Schools and nurseries followed suit. A classroom might throw open the windows for vigorous circulation, while simultaneously shuffling children away from endangered zones near the edges. Nurses were trained to sense drafts like bloodhounds, rushing across room to shut even the tiniest crack if they suspected unauthorized airflow. Children learned early that the air around them was both friend and foe, a magical substance that healed or harmed, depending on which adult was currently in charge. The entire ventilation saga mirrored the Victorian worldview perfectly, full of confidence, fear, contradiction, and the unwavering belief that health was a matter of moral correctness rather than common sense. Did fresh air make children hardy or fragile? No one knew, but that didn't stop everyone from acting like they absolutely did. With airflow panic now behind us, your next chapter can dive into the chaos of swaddling, explore the strange belief that children needed to be wrapped like tiny soldiers in fabric armour, or move into how Victorian society feared imagination like a contagious fever, whichever direction fits your unfolding narrative. Victorian Britain adored structure. Routines, schedules, rigid moral codes, furniture arranged in symmetrical harmony, everything needed to be in its proper place. And naturally, this attitude extended to babies as well. To many Victorians, an infant's natural state, wiggly, unpredictable, squirmy, loud, was a direct affront to the order of the universe. Their solution? Swaddle the child into a tightly wrapped parcel of silence and stillness, producing what can only be described as a Victorian burrito with moral aspirations. To understand swaddling in this era, you must first understand the Victorian fear of limbs. Arms and legs were considered suspicious entities that needed strict guidance lest they grow crooked, splay in inappropriate directions, or, heaven forbid, encourage the child to move with too much enthusiasm. Babies who kicked were babies who lacked discipline. Babies who squirmed were babies flirting with future chaos. And babies who flailed their arms? Well, that was practically the gateway to moral collapse. Victorians believed deeply in the power of fabric as a tool of character formation. Wrap a baby tightly enough, they argued, and you would not only straighten their limbs but their soul as well. A child neatly bound was a child predisposed to neatness, obedience, and a lifelong tendency to sit very still at social gatherings. The idea that infants might naturally want to stretch or shift was considered irrelevant. Nature, as always, was something Victorians attempted to correct with fervour and linen. Swaddling was not a gentle wrapping either. It was a full-body immobilisation strategy executed with military precision. The goal was to transform the baby into a compact, motionless cylinder, something tidy, portable, and incapable of flinging its tiny fists like a rebellious wind-up toy. Some swaddling instructions went into elaborate detail about how to fold, tuck, layer, and tighten the cloth to achieve maximum restraint. The finished result sometimes resembled an oversized doll, trussed up with all the freedom of a decorative log. There were debates, heated ones, about just how immobile a baby should be. Some manuals advocated for extreme rigidity, insisting infants should be bound so firmly that their bodies remained perfectly straight. These authors warned that any slackness in the wrapping might result in crooked bones, poor posture, or an unfortunate tendency towards slouching later in life. Victorian parents were told that a single careless tuck could lead to years of regret, and more importantly, years of judgment from other parents. Other experts offered a slightly more relaxed approach. They agreed that babies needed firm wrapping, but argued they should at least be allowed to bend their legs a little. Just a little, though, no need to get carried away. A few even suggested leaving enough room for a sigh or a shallow breath. But generally speaking, freedom of movement was seen as dangerous. Mobility was equated with misbehaviour. A tightly wrapped baby was considered a good baby, by which Victorians meant a baby that poses no visible threat to household tranquility. Some families swaddled infants for months at a time, unwrapping them only for feeding, brief airing, or inspection. Others wrapped and rewrapped throughout the day, adjusting the layers according to temperature or mood, the parent's mood, naturally, not the baby's. There were even parents who believed babies should sleep swaddled during the day and remain partially swaddled at night to ensure their limbs remained on the straight and narrow. Victorians approached swaddling like origami with moral consequences. The swaddling material itself varied by class. Wealthier families used fine linen or cotton, sometimes embroidered, because even when immobilizing infants, upper-class Victorians still made fashion a priority. Working-class families used whatever cloth was available: old skirts, worn blankets, repurposed shawls, proving that swaddling was a parenting convention accessible to anyone determined to keep their child from moving more than a few centimetres at a time. Of course, debates about swaddling spilled into every corner of Victorian society. Newspapers published letters from anxious parents wondering whether they had wrapped too loosely or too tightly. Doctors offered contradictory advice with absolute confidence. Neighbours judged each other behind lace curtains. If someone's child grew up slightly bow-legged, the swaddling was blamed. If someone's child grew up with perfect posture, the swaddling was praised. The practice was a moral and physical litmus test, one that mothers felt pressured to pass daily. But swaddling went beyond physical correction. To many Victorians, it was about instilling discipline early, and a newborn should learn that life had limits. The world would not always allow them to stretch freely, so why should infancy? A tightly wrapped baby was proof that parents valued order, restraint, and the fine art of keeping small humans as still as possible. Unsurprisingly, many Victorian babies responded to this ritual by screaming with the kind of intensity only infants possess. But the manuals insisted this was normal, expected, healthy, even admirable. After all, if the child cried while swaddled, that simply meant the treatment was doing its work. And yet, despite all the stern theories, some parents eventually admitted defeat. There were babies who wriggled free like escaping magicians, leaving their swaddles in tatters on the nursery floor. Others thrashed with such determination that even the most iron-willed mother surrendered. These infants were whispered about with awe, baby Houdinis who simply refused to be shaped by linen and societal expectations. In the end, Victorian swaddling reveals a great deal about the era's worldview. The belief that discipline must begin before a child can crawl, that the natural impulse to move must be tamed, and that fabric, when applied correctly, could solve nearly any problem. Babies were expected to lie still, grow straight, and emerge from their burrito years as perfectly formed citizens of a perfectly rigid society. For the next chapter, you could slide smoothly into the Victorian suspicion of playthings, expose the moral panic over toys, or travel into the culture of child-size manners, each offering its own deliciously absurd insight into how the era tried to turn children into miniature adults before they could even stand. Victorian Britain had a way of turning even the smallest, most innocent object into a battleground of moral philosophy, and toys were no exception. In a world where everything from fresh air to cradles came with contradictory instructions, it should surprise no one that a wooden horse or a cloth doll could spark debates worthy of Parliament. To some Victorians, toys were essential tools for shaping the mind. To others, they were tiny Trojan horses smuggling frivolity straight into the soul. And as always, class shaped the rules. Working-class toys and upper-class toys lived in completely different universes, one patched together from scraps and survival, the other curated with the intensity of museum collections. Victorian moralists were deeply suspicious of fun. If something made a child smile, they considered it guilty until proven innocent. Joy, in their worldview, was like sugar, dangerously sweet, best consumed in moderation, and definitely not something you let a child get addicted to. Toys fit squarely into this category of potential doom. A toy might encourage imagination, which could lead to daydreaming, which could lead to laziness, which could lead to delinquency, which could lead to the child becoming French, perhaps. The slippery slope was never clearly defined, but the danger felt real to them. One popular Victorian fear was that toys might foster vanity or pride. A doll too pretty. Dangerous. A toy soldier too heroic-looking. Risky. A toy horse with a bit too much spirit. Practically a gateway to moral decline. Parents were urged to choose toys with a stern seriousness that only intensified as the stakes in their minds grew. A wrong toy choice, they believed, could shape character in the wrong direction, towards selfishness or frivolity, or even dishonour. Yes, dishonour. In the Victorian imagination, a colourful spinning top could start a child on the path to disgrace. This anxiety led many upper and middle-class parents to insist that toys must be educational above all else. No toy was allowed simply because it was fun. It had to mould the mind, strengthen the will, or prepare the child for some future duty. A doll wasn't just a doll, it was a tool for teaching maternal responsibility. A miniature tea set wasn't for play, it was a practice kit for hosting proper gatherings. A toy soldier wasn't entertainment, it was training for patriotism and discipline. They believed toys could build virtues if chosen wisely, and destroy them if selected poorly, which made toy shopping feel like moral bomb defusal. This was why wealthy families curated toy rooms the way collectors curate art. Carefully, somberly, and with a faint sense of dread. Only the right toys were admitted, those that reflected social status and proper values. Wooden blocks were acceptable because they taught geometry and patience. Hobby horses were fine if they looked dignified. Mechanical toys were admired for their cleverness, but only if they didn't encourage thoughtless amusement. A toy that did nothing but spark joy was deeply suspect. Victorians wanted childhood to resemble adulthood as closely as possible, so toys that promoted imagination were treated with the same level of suspicion reserved for burglars. On the other side of the social spectrum, working-class children had an entirely different relationship with toys, mainly because they didn't have many. For most poor families, toys were luxuries. A child might treasure a single rag doll, a carved whistle, or a homemade ball fashioned out of leftover fabric scraps. These toys weren't moral statements. They were acts of love in households that had little to spare. A father might carve a wooden horse from firewood, or a mother might stitch a doll from torn clothing. No one debated whether the toy was building virtue or inviting sin. No one consulted a manual. The toy existed because a child needed a small spot of joy in a world that gave them very few. This didn't mean working-class toys weren't judged by outsiders. Middle and upper-class critics loved to scold the poor for giving their children idle amusements, even though many poor children spent their days working or running errands. An upper-class mother who fretted over whether a painted Noah's Ark might encourage pride would turn around and accuse a working-class toy of fostering mischief. Victorian society had a remarkable talent for blaming the poor for things they themselves were doing, just with fancier woodwork. Working-class children, unsurprisingly, had far more freedom in how they played. Their toys weren't tools of education or moral training. They were outlets, brief escapes from harsh realities. A simple spinning top might be treasured more deeply than any elaborate toy in a wealthy nursery, because it wasn't chosen strategically. It belonged to the child for no reason other than the joy it brought. Imagination in poor children wasn't dangerous, it was survival. Meanwhile, wealthy parents continued their delicate balancing act of offering toys that stimulated the mind but didn't overstimulate it, encouraged creativity but not too much creativity, and allowed fun but only the morally acceptable type of fun, the kind where you learn something. A child playing with blocks was adorable. A child making the blocks into fantasy castles full of imaginary creatures? Alarm bells, that was how chaos began. The Victorian toy debate reached peak absurdity when moralists warned that toys with too many details could overstimulate the senses, causing restless thoughts. The solution, they said, was plainness, simplicity. Toys should be interesting enough to teach, but not interesting enough to distract. Being a Victorian child meant learning to enjoy toys without enjoying them too much. In the end, toys in Victorian society reveal the era's eternal struggle. The desire to raise obedient, dignified children while quietly fearing that play, simple, innocent play, might undo all their hard work. Toys were seen as both tools and threats, depending on which manual you read and which neighbour you wanted to impress. For your next chapter, you could glide into the Victorian attempt to turn children into miniature adults, explore the strict expectations of posture and poise, or jump straight into the era's obsession with emotional suppression, each offering its own fresh slice of delightful absurdity. In Victorian Britain, childhood wasn't treated as a magical phase of discovery, imagination, and sticky fingers. It was treated as a dress rehearsal for adulthood, and not even the fun parts of adulthood, like independence or choosing your own hat. No, Victorian children were expected to imitate the most rigid, polished, and impossibly dull aspects of grown-up behaviour. If adults were stoic, children must be statues. If adults sat upright, children must sit even straighter. If adults spoke gently and formally, children must speak like junior ambassadors at a diplomatic luncheon. Victorian childhood, where fun goes to die. To Victorian parents, a child was essentially a very small adult who happened to need shorter clothing. The idea that children had developmental stages, emotional needs, or brains that required time to mature simply didn't exist. Children were mirrors, living, breathing reflections of their parents' refinement. How they walked, talked, sat and breathed was scrutinized with the same intensity one might use when inspecting fine china. If a child even hinted at childish behaviour, it was viewed as a personal failure in the household's moral engineering. Manners were the first battlefield. A Victorian child was expected to absorb etiquette rules the way modern kids absorb screen time, constantly, instinctively, and without complaint. Politeness wasn't encouraged, it was mandatory. Children learned how to greet adults with stiff courtesy, how to remain silent unless spoken to, how to avoid interrupting, and how to sit perfectly still even when their legs tingled with the universal childhood urge to wiggle. Entire books were written to instruct children on the proper use of their limbs, as if arms and legs were misbehaving servants that needed firm instruction. Stillness was a virtue. A fidgeting child was a shameful sight indicating inner chaos or, heaven forbid, an imaginative mind. Victorian moralists treated restless energy like a contagious condition that had to be stamped out early. Children were drilled in the art of sitting, standing, and walking with grace. A slouch wasn't just a bad posture, it was a character flaw. A child who slumped in their chair risked being accused of growing into someone unreliable, lazy, or possibly French, and the ultimate Victorian insult. Even facial expressions were monitored. Smiling too freely suggested frivolity. Laughing too loudly hinted at wildness. Showing irritation meant you lacked dignity. Expressing boredom was unacceptable because Victorian adults refused to acknowledge the existence of boredom, even though their daily routine strongly suggested otherwise. Children learned to maintain a calm, neutral expression, a look best described as "I am here against my will, but I accept this fate with quiet resignation." Formality infiltrated every aspect of childhood. Playtime, if it existed at all, was often limited, scripted, or supervised. Children were taught to behave as if they were always in the presence of important visitors, even when they were alone. The phrase "act your age" didn't exist for one simple reason. No one wanted children to act their age. Your average Victorian child lived under the constant pressure of being watched, evaluated, and judged on everything from their vocabulary to the angle of their chin. Childhood spontaneity was treated like an intruder in the house, something to be shut down quickly before it upset the delicate order. In wealthy families, the transformation into a mini-adult was almost ceremonial. Children attended drawing room events wearing miniature versions of their parents' clothing, forced to navigate conversations they barely understood. They practiced bowing and curtsying until their spines protested. They recited poems for guests, not because they enjoyed fetchery, but because performance demonstrated discipline. Even their toys, if allowed, mimicked adult tools, tiny sewing kits, miniature writing desks, tiny tea sets with real etiquette rules attached like fine print. Working-class children, meanwhile, had a very different path to adulthood, one that came much faster, and often through necessity rather than etiquette drills. Many were expected to take on chores or jobs at young ages, contributing to household income or assisting with siblings. Their transformation into mini-adults wasn't about posture, it was about responsibility. If middle-class parents forced their children into emotional adulthood, working-class families required practical adulthood. Still, the underlying belief remained the same. Childhood was temporary, functional, and certainly not a time of carefree joy. this mindset shaped children's internal landscapes. They learned to suppress impulses, silence curiosity, and monitor every movement for signs of impropriety. Victorian guidebooks warned that childish immaturity must be corrected quickly, as if it were a stain that might deepen if left untreated. A child who daydreamed too much was lectured about discipline. A child who asked too many questions risked being told that seeking answers was impolite. A child who expressed creativity was gently discouraged, or not so gently, depending on the household. The irony, of course, is that while children were expected to behave like adults, they were never granted adult autonomy. They endured all the pressures of adulthood without any of the freedoms. They could not choose their clothes, their meals, their schedule, or even their thoughts if their parents had anything to say about it. Imagine being told to sit still and act dignified while wearing an itchy outfit, listening to adults discuss topics you didn't understand, and knowing full well that the slightest twitch could lead to an etiquette lecture. Victorian children mastered the art of suffering politely, and yet this belief in crafting miniature adults persisted because Victorians feared chaos. They feared the unpredictability of childhood, the wildness of imagination, and the raw energy of youth. They believed that if they didn't shape children early, painfully early, society would fall into disrepair. Order had to be maintained, even if it meant squeezing the spontaneity out of every child like juice from a lemon. With mini-adulthood now firmly established, your next chapter can descend into the Victorian war against emotions, explore why feelings were treated like dangerous leaks in the moral plumbing, or slide into the strange punishments designed to keep children obedient, whichever absurd avenue of history you'd like to tackle next. If the Victorians could have bottled emotions the way they bottled pickles, they would have sealed every feeling behind airtight lids and labelled them open only in emergencies. To them, emotions were unpredictable forces, messy, embarrassing, potentially dangerous, and certainly nothing you wanted leaking out of a child in public. So Victorian parenting deployed a level of emotional discipline that would make even the strictest modern boarding school look like a spa retreat. Children were taught, sometimes gently and sometimes with unsettling conviction, that feelings were things to manage, muffle, or preferably never display at all. Crying especially was treated like a moral defect. A child who cried too easily was said to possess a weak constitution, a phrase Victorians used so often it might as well have been embroidered on nursery pillows. Tears weren't interpreted as hunger, fear, or exhaustion. They were interpreted as character flaws. A crying child was undisciplined, spoiled, and worst of all, overly indulged. Parents fretted that if a child cried today, they might develop bad habits tomorrow. Habits like having opinions, or expecting sympathy, or acknowledging their own humanity. Victorian manuals brimmed with stern warnings about emotional expression. Teach the child mastery of the feelings, one guide insisted, else the feelings shall master the child. Translation: if little Henry sobs because his toy horse broke, he could grow up to be a complete disaster. The manuals never specified how this transformation occurred, but the message was clear. Shut down the tears before the tears shut down society. And of course, crying wasn't the only emotional offender. Anger, excitement, frustration, fear, glee, delight, all of them were viewed as suspicious states that needed to be clamped down immediately. Joy, in particular, was treated like a suspicious relative who might cause trouble at the dinner table. If a child laughed too loudly, adults frowned. If a child displayed too much enthusiasm, adults lectured. Children were expected to maintain a calm, composed exterior at all times, as though auditioning for the role of very serious young person number 3 in the grand play of Victorian life. Parents believed that emotional restraint prepared children for adulthood. After all, the adult Victorian world was built upon stoicism and decorum. You didn't want children growing up comfortable with expressive emotions. That level of self-confidence might lead to all sorts of chaos, like speaking one's mind or questioning authority. Better to train them early, smooth the face, quiet the voice, straighten the posture, and lock down the internal weather system. If a child felt the need to express emotion, they were encouraged to do so silently and privately, preferably in a room no one ever used, with the curtains drawn. Public behaviour was the pinnacle of emotional discipline. Children accompanying parents in public spaces were expected to maintain absolute composure, regardless of circumstances. A bumped elbow? Remain silent. A bee buzzing near the face? Do not flinch. A loud noise that scared the soul from your body? Breathe deeply and pretend it did not happen. Victorian children learned early that their inner experiences were irrelevant compared to the outer performance. The world demanded emotional calm, and so calm they must appear, even if they were one moment away from collapsing into a tiny, well-dressed puddle. This emotional training often began shockingly early. Parents would praise infants who appeared quiet and good-tempered, which usually meant doesn't make noise that inconveniences adults. Toddlers were taught to control their faces the moment they learned how to make expressions. If a child showed too much sadness, parents encouraged bravery. If they showed too much happiness, parents encouraged modesty. The only acceptable emotional states were mild contentment or subdued politeness. Of course, this level of emotional suppression occasionally produced the opposite of the intended result. Children learned to bottle feelings so effectively that they became masters at pushing everything down: fear, excitement, joy, sorrow, until it all simmered quietly beneath the surface. Some children became anxious shadows trying desperately to stay within the rules, while others grew into adults who couldn't identify their own feelings even with a magnifying glass. But in Victorian society, this was considered evidence of success. A calm exterior meant the moral training had taken root. The moral panic around crying reached absurd levels in some households. A tearful outburst from a child could trigger parental lectures lasting far longer than the emotional moment that caused them. Adults warned that tears invited weakness, and weakness invited illness, and illness invited ruin. No one explained the logic, but everyone repeated it. Parents became experts at redirecting children's emotions. If a child cried over a scraped knee, they were told to be brave. If they cried from fear, they were told to be strong. If they cried because they were overwhelmed, they were told to sit quietly until the feeling passed. Victorian children learned early that tears had consequences, not because anyone intended cruelty, but because emotional restraint was seen as an essential life skill. There were, however, cracks in the system. Some parents softened behind closed doors, offering sympathy and comfort away from watchful eyes. A mother might stroke her child's hair, whisper a soothing word, or hold them in a moment of quiet rebellion against the manuals. A father might slip a comforting treat to a distraught child when no one was looking. But these tender acts were usually kept secret. Publicly, the family maintained its polished veneer, because showing emotional softness felt like confessing a moral failure. In the end, Victorian emotional suppression wasn't about cruelty. It was about survival in a society that valued restraint above authenticity. The belief that strong feelings were dangerous shaped an entire generation of children into poised, rigid, dignified mini-adults who knew how to sit still, speak softly, and hide their hearts behind embroidered collars. For your next chapter, you could flow naturally into the fascinating punishments Victorians devised to reinforce this emotional discipline, or shift towards the peculiar rituals of bedtime and the ambient terror Victorian parents felt about sleep. Whichever direction best builds the narrative. Victorian Britain never met a punishment it didn't want to overcomplicate. If modern parenting sometimes swings too far towards softness, Victorian parenting sprinted in the opposite direction and kept running until it tripped over a lace tablecloth. Their disciplinary methods were a mixture of moral philosophy, theatrical performance, and sheer imaginative strangeness. The goal was always the same: shape the child into a disciplined, obedient, emotionally silent miniature adult. But the methods, they could make even the strictest modern parent blink twice and think, Are you sure this is necessary? One of the most eyebrow-raising Victorian punishments was mask discipline. Some families owned a set of moral masks, papier-mâché faces painted with exaggerated sadness, wickedness, foolishness, or shame. A misbehaving child could be forced to wear one as a sort of emotional timeout cosplay. Imagine a 6-year-old who spilled milk being marched to the corner wearing a giant mask of disobedience, staring out through painted eye holes while adults discuss their misdeed, like a scene from a tragic opera. The masks were meant to inspire reflection. In practice, they inspired nightmares. The logic behind mask discipline was Victorian to the core. If a child acted foolishly, make them literally wear foolishness. If a child acted selfishly, put on the face of selfishness. If a child spoke out of turn, place the mask of impudence upon their tiny head and instruct them to contemplate their moral failings. If nothing else, the experience probably taught children that misbehaviour led to extremely strange wardrobe choices. Then there was moral shaming, a punishment genre so vast that the Victorians practically turned it into an art form. A child who misbehaved might be forced to stand in front of siblings and recite a moral poem about obedience. They might be made to apologise in stiff formal sentences that sounded more like legal statements than genuine remorse. Some households kept virtue journals where misbehaviours were recorded in ink and reviewed aloud later, like a disappointing performance evaluation. Every flicker of wrongdoing became a teaching opportunity, because what better way to build character than through a weekly review of your personal failures? Victorian parents believed deeply in the power of reflection. Children were encouraged, strongly, to ponder their moral shortcomings with the seriousness of adults contemplating their taxes. If a child spoke too loudly, they might be asked to sit and reflect upon the noise within their spirit. If they ran inside the house, they might be told to consider the dangers of impulsive living. To the modern eye, it's hard not to imagine Victorian kids quietly wishing someone would invent the concept of just say sorry and move on. But possibly the most unique discipline method was the silence drill, a punishment so Victorian it practically wore a bonnet. Silence drills required the child to sit or stand in perfect stillness and make no sound whatsoever for a designated period. Not a whisper, not a sigh, not even a sneeze. Unless they wanted to risk extending the drill, some drills lasted minutes, others lasted hours. The child's job was to demonstrate total control over their body and voice, a sort of meditative test, except with far less serenity and far more parental staring. Silence drills reflected the era's obsession with self-control. Victorians believed that mastering silence meant mastering one's impulses. If a child could sit motionless for half an hour without blinking too enthusiastically, that was viewed as a triumph of character. Of course, to the child, it probably felt like serving a tiny prison sentence in the parlour. Fear-based teachings were also popular, because nothing shapes moral virtue like a mild existential crisis. Adults told cautionary tales about naughty children who suffered dire consequences. The girl who wandered too far and was eaten by wolves, the boy who lied and was carried off by strangers, the child who touched forbidden objects and suffered dramatic and suspiciously convenient calamities. These stories weren't just bedtime entertainment, they were tools. The goal was to imprint a fear of misbehaviour so deeply that the child wouldn't dare break a rule. Victorian children grew up terrified not only of disappointing adults, but also of random cosmic punishments lurking around every corner. One of the stranger punishments was public freezing, not with actual ice, but with sudden emotional coldness. A misbehaving child might be temporarily cut off from affection. Parents would adopt a deliberately distant manner, speaking formally, withholding warmth, and interacting with the child as if they were a slightly unwelcome visitor. The shock of an emotional withdrawal was supposed to teach humility. It usually taught confusion. Nothing quite says learn from your mistakes, like your mother suddenly addressing you with the tone typically reserved for distant cousins who overstay their visit. Some families also practiced appearance-based punishment, where a child who behaved badly was made to wear unfashionable or mismatched clothing for the day. The logic was that internal disorder should be reflected externally, creating a walking cautionary tale. Other punishments involved overly rigid posture training, making a child balance books on their head for long stretches, or stand with their back against a wall until they could demonstrate a posture so perfect it could have been illustrated in an etiquette manual. And of course there were the simple old-fashioned punishments, standing in corners, writing repetitive lines, losing privileges, or being sent to their room, often a room so drafty and austere that room was a generous word for it. The difference in the Victorian approach was the intensity, the sense that every tiny misstep was a moral infraction requiring elaborate correction. Yet beneath all this severity, Victorians weren't trying to be cruel. They genuinely believed that discipline early in life prevented misery later. They saw childhood as a training ground for adulthood, and discipline as the compass that kept children from wandering into ruin. It was a worldview built on fear, structure, and a deep desire to protect children from the unpredictable forces of the world by preparing them to be as predictable as possible. Now that the punishments are out of the way, your next chapter could glide into the Victorian panic over sleep routines, explore the contradictory theories about nighttime air and lamplight, or move into early schooling practices where children learn to endure classrooms with the endurance of tiny soldiers. Each direction offers its own fresh layer of delightful Victorian absurdity. Victorian bedtime was not a peaceful nightly ritual. It was a carefully engineered operation involving conflicting advice, whispered fears, and enough contradictory rules to make any parent wonder if sleep itself was a dangerous hobby. To modern readers, bedtime might seem simple. Dim lights, comfortable temperature, maybe a lullaby, but to Victorians, bedtime was a tactical negotiation between health, morality, superstition, and a fear of unseen forces prowling through the night. Every choice of a lamp or no lamp, window open or close, blankets thick or thin, felt like the difference between raising a healthy child or summoning doom into the nursery. The first major debate centered on light. Some parenting books insisted a child must sleep in total darkness to preserve their nerve strength. Darkness, these authors argued, toughened the mind, sharpened the senses, and prevented overstimulation. Lamps were discouraged because the flickering glow was said to agitate the imagination, inviting unsettling dreams, or worse, encouraging children to see shapes in shadows and spiral into fanciful thinking, which Victorians always viewed with mild horror. But other manuals insisted the opposite. A lamp should burn all night to protect the child from waking in terror. These experts warned that a pitch-black room fed nightmares, encouraged melancholy, and left children vulnerable to fearful awakenings. A small bedside lamp, they said, created soothing reassurance. And so Victorian bedtime became a tug-of-war between the fear of darkness creating dread and the fear of lamplight creating too much drama. The lamp debate grew more intense when you factored in the actual lamps. In a world where lighting involved open flames, kerosene, or gas, leaving a light burning all night meant willingly adding fire risk to bedtime. Some manuals recognised this danger and added new rules. If the lamp stayed lit, it had to be placed precisely 2 feet away from curtains, high enough to prevent a child from touching it, and low enough not to shock the eyes. No one mentioned how difficult arranging all this was while holding a sleepy, squirming child who just wanted to lie down. Even once the issue of light was settled, parents faced the eternal Victorian battlefield of temperature. The advice split into 2 equally confident yet mutually exclusive camps. The first camp championed warm rooms. They argued that children were delicate creatures who needed cocoon-like warmth to thrive. A cold room, they insisted, invited illness, stiff of joints and shivering of the moral will, a wonderfully vague phrase that sounded serious enough to frighten parents into adding an extra blanket. The second camp believed warm rooms were invitations to weakness. Heat was indulgent. Heat softened children. Heat, in their minds, made bodies lazy and lungs fragile. These experts preached the gospel of the bracing bedroom, where crisp air kept children alert, hearty, and morally upright. According to them, a slightly chilly child would become a resilient adult. In some households, this produced bedrooms so cold the wallpaper practically shivered. Then came the issue of airflow, which Victorians approached with theatrical paranoia. Some believed fresh air at night was life-saving, arguing that children needed proper ventilation to avoid night vapours. Others were convinced that any moving air during sleep, even a gentle breeze, was a death sentence. They feared ghost drafts, elusive currents that snuck into happy rooms like mischievous spirits, bent on giving children chills, fevers, or nervous fits. This left parents pacing anxiously around rooms, checking corners, testing windows, and waving hands near door cracks to detect any rogue airflow that might be plotting harm. The result was nightly chaos. A mother might open the window because the manual told her fresh air was necessary, only for a relative to march in and slam it shut because drafts were murderous. Households invented strange compromises. Windows cracked open but covered with thick curtains. Beds moved closer to the centre of the room to escape imaginary breezes, or chairs stacked against a wall because someone heard the wind whistle there once. Ghost drafts became the villains of bedtime, unseen, unprovable, but constantly blamed. Even bed placement turned into a science of superstition. Parents fretted about radiating cold from exterior walls. They worried about too much warmth near fireplaces. They agonised over placing beds near windows, dangerous drafts, near doors, household disturbances, near mirrors, nighttime reflections causing fright, or near corners, where stagnant air built up like invisible sludge. The simplest solution, placing the bed anywhere, was never an option. There had to be strategy, there had to be meaning. Otherwise, what kind of Victorian household was it? Nightmares brought another layer of panic. Children prone to bad dreams were treated like tiny oracles warning of deeper issues. A nightmare wasn't just a bad dream, it was a symptom. Something was amiss: the lighting, the temperature, the bedding, the child's diet, or perhaps the moral climate of the home. Parents responded with elaborate bedtime procedures. Some insisted children pray longer. Others lectured them about avoiding disturbing thoughts, which was ironic, because being told to avoid frightening ideas just before bed tends to produce the exact opposite effect. As if all this wasn't enough, Victorians also feared sleep positions. Manuals warned that certain positions compressed lungs or strained the spine. Children were encouraged to lie straight, like tiny soldiers resting between battles. Rolling over during the night was discouraged. Fidgeting was viewed as a sign of internal disorder. Parents would check on their sleeping children not to make sure they were breathing, but to make sure they hadn't shifted into a morally questionable pose. In the end, Victorian bedtime reveals an era tangled in its own anxieties. Every decision was loaded with consequence. Light or dark, warm or cold, airflow or none, everything mattered, yet no one agreed on anything. And so parents tiptoed around their sleeping children, adjusting curtains, repositioning lamps, rearranging blankets, and waging quiet war against imaginary drafts, all while praying they had guessed the correct combination for the night. For your next chapter, you can drift naturally into Victorian schooling, dive into the exhausting world of academic expectations, or explore the relentless etiquette drills that shaped young minds. Whichever direction builds the next stage of your historical journey. Victorian schooling did not gently introduce children to knowledge. It hurled them into an academic marathon that could make even a modern adult break into a cold sweat. Forget colourful classrooms, creative projects, and teachers who encourage curiosity. A Victorian school was more like a compressed training facility designed to produce obedient, well-behaved citizens using the combined powers of exhaustion, repetition, and chalk dust. If you've ever heard someone say school builds character, they probably didn't mean it the way Victorians did. Victorian homework didn't teach resilience, it taught despair. A school day typically began early, often at an hour most children today would associate with mythical birds or farmers. Students shuffled into classrooms that were either freezing or stifling depending on the season and the architectural whims of the building. The room itself was a study in austerity. Hard benches, wooden desks, a blackboard dominating the front, and walls so plain they practically encouraged daydreaming, which, of course, was strictly forbidden. Teachers kept eagle eyes on every twitch, whisper, or wandering gaze. Your mind was to stay as straight as your posture, and your posture had better be perfect. Victorian education prized rote memorization, a practice so intense it could turn multiplication tables into minor nightmares. Children weren't encouraged to understand concepts so much as repeat them flawlessly. Lessons were recited in unison, dozens of young voices chanting facts like a tiny choir of weary scholars. Geography, history, arithmetic, religious texts. Everything was memorized, repeated, tested, and repeated again for good measure. A student might memorize the rivers of England before understanding what a river actually was. Learning wasn't an experience, it was an exercise in endurance. And then there was handwriting, a task treated with the seriousness of military training. Penmanship was not simply a subject, it was a moral discipline. A shaky letter hinted at shaky character. A crooked line suggested a crooked mind. Children practiced rows upon rows of identical strokes, loops, curls, and slants, all while gripping dip pens that dripped ink with malicious intent. Students were taught to keep their wrists stiff, their back straight, and their elbows at a precise angle. A good Victorian handwriting lesson could feel like choreographed suffering, with the goal of producing elegant script by a child who could barely sit comfortably. Mistakes, naturally, were not appreciated. A blot of ink, a misspelled word, or, heaven forbid, a smudge, could earn a sharp reprimand or a stern lecture about discipline. Some schools even had penmanship monitors, older students who patrolled the room like tiny handwriting police, enforcing the rules and correcting infractions before the teacher even had a chance to glare. Imagine being 8 years old and already terrified of your own punctuation. Academic rigour extended far into the day. Victorian school hours were long, structured and relentless. Breaks were rare and brief, just enough time for children to stretch stiff limbs, whisper a complaint to a friend, and then return to the desk before someone accused them of idleness. Many subjects were crammed into a single day, and each demanded total seriousness. Art, only if it trained the hand. Music, only if it trained the voice. Literature, only if the story contained clear moral lessons, condemning the slightest hint of whimsy. The school environment itself was designed to foster discipline. Silence was golden. Students rarely asked questions, partly because curiosity was seen as disruptive, and partly because some teachers had perfected the terrifying skill of brow-raising disapproval. A child who dared speak out of turn risked reprimand, punishment, or being assigned more lines to copy at home. Victorian educators believed learning should never be comfortable. Comfort led to distraction. Distraction led to laziness. Laziness, naturally, led to moral decay. And then there was the homework, an evening ritual guaranteed to drain whatever joy remained after the school day. Assignments involved copying texts, memorizing passages, or answering long lists of questions with short, precise, and utterly uncreative answers. A child might spend hours bent over a dimly lit desk, quill in hand, copying sentences until their fingers cramped. If the ink spilled, they didn't just lose time, they lost dignity. Victorian homework wasn't about reinforcing lessons. It was about testing endurance, obedience, and a child's willingness to sacrifice their evening to the altar of discipline. Moral instruction was woven into every subject, like threads of guilt. Lessons weren't just about arithmetic or spelling. They were about shaping the soul. Stories praised good children who followed rules and punished fictional youngsters who dared to rebel. Essays focused on virtues such as humility, orderliness, and hard work. Teachers lectured students on proper behaviour with the fervour of preachers, blending academics with moral sermons. The underlying message was clear. Education wasn't merely about learning facts, it was about learning how to behave. Even the atmosphere of the classroom pressed this message home. The teacher's desk dominated the front like a symbol of unquestionable authority. Some instructors kept canes hanging visibly on hooks, not necessarily to use, but to remind the students that this was a place of seriousness. Children learned early to fear mistakes more than ignorance. Better to be shunt than to be wrong. And yet, despite the strictness, many Victorian children emerged from school with impressive knowledge and equally impressive stories of survival. The system wasn't gentle, but it was thorough in its own relentless way. Children learn discipline, structure, and how to endure long hours without collapsing into a fit of boredom or rebellion. They also learn to write beautifully, recite accurately, and sit still for unreasonable amounts of time, skills that serve them well in a society that prized composure above comfort. Now that schooling has marched bitterly into the narrative, your next chapter can glide into the Victorian obsession with manners, exploring how posture, poise, and perfect table etiquette ruled the social world of children, or move into the labyrinth of clothing rules that turned dressing a child into a moral ritual. Each path continues the delightful exploration of Victorian contradictions. Victorian Britain did not merely value manners, it treated them like a divine commandment. To the Victorian mind, manners weren't just polite behaviours, they were the visible proof of one's moral worth, spiritual health, and social eligibility. And if adults were expected to maintain flawless etiquette, children were expected to perform it with twice the effort and none of the comprehension. The younger the child, the stricter the scrutiny. Victorians truly believed polite children are godly children, and they built an entire system of instruction, drills, correction, and theatrical expectations to ensure that every child reflected this holy truth. From the moment a Victorian child could walk with minimal wobbling, they entered the world of posture policing, an institution as rigid as the straight-back chairs children were expected to sit in. Good posture wasn't just considered physically beneficial, it was a moral posture as well. A straight spine meant straight character, a drooping shoulder meant drooping virtue. Parents lectured children about bearing with the same seriousness they reserved for discussions of sin. A child caught slouching could expect a stern lecture about weakness, laziness, or a disappointing future in which they would inevitably bring shame to the household simply because they couldn't keep their shoulders square. Walking became its own discipline. Children took lessons not just in movement but in correct movement. They were taught to glide, not stomp, to step with grace, not enthusiasm, to appear balanced, poised and controlled even if their tiny legs wanted nothing more than to break into a joyful sprint. Some families hired tutors specifically for walking lessons, individuals whose sole job was to instruct children in the fine art of moving without looking like a child. The goal was to produce miniature diplomats who floated across rooms as if weighted by the manners instead of gravity. Then came greeting drills, which began approximately at the moment a child learned to speak. Proper greetings were essential badges of respectability. Children practiced curtsies, bows, handshakes, and polite phrases until they became second nature, or at least until they'd learned to perform them on command. A Victorian child could be called upon at any time to greet a visiting adult properly. If they hesitated, forgot a phrase, or bowed too quickly, they were reminded that politeness was not a casual matter, it was a sacred duty. Imagine a 5-year-old being coached like an ambassador. "No, darling, you must bow lower, lower, and not that low, now you look like you're searching for dropped coins. Try again." A polite child was praised with saintly admiration. An impolite child was treated like a walking moral emergency. Mealtime was its own battlefield, a war fought with spoons, forks, napkins, and an army of unspoken rules. Table etiquette was not something children eventually learned, it was something they were expected to master early, without hesitation, and without ever giving the impression they were enjoying themselves. Eating was a choreographed performance. Chew quietly, sit upright, do not spill, do not slurp, do not hunch over your plate like a starving street urchin. Do not swing your legs, do not tap your fingers, do not gesture with cutlery unless you wish to be accused of barbarism. Some households went further, staging full rehearsal dinners where children practiced dining as if performing in a play. The slightest slip, a dropped fork, a misplaced elbow, a sigh too loud, could earn a child a firm correction or a lecture on the greater consequences of sloppy behaviour. Dinner was not a nourishment. It was training for survival in polite society. And Victorian society made sure these expectations followed children everywhere. Visiting someone's home required a flawless greeting. Attending church required silent posture perfection. Participating in social gatherings demanded poise so intense it practically strangled spontaneity. Even playtime, and when permitted, came with rules. Roughhousing was frowned upon. Loud laughter triggered warnings. Even excitement was regulated, because unrestrained enthusiasm was seen as a potential moral hazard. Children quickly learned that the safest emotional state was polite neutrality. They existed in a world of perpetual performance, where every movement, expression and gesture was graded by adults who had spent their entire lives perfecting the art of visible restraint. Manners weren't just behaviours, they were shields against criticism. A child who mastered manners was considered virtuous, trustworthy, and properly prepared for adulthood. A child who struggled with them was assumed to lack discipline, self-control, or worse, good breeding. Of course, some families pushed this etiquette obsession into near-comical territory. Children practiced balancing books on their heads to train posture. They repeated polite phrases until they sounded like tiny Victorian parrots. They learned how to stand in drawing rooms with hands placed neatly before them like miniature butlers. Some particularly strict households required children to rehearse entering and leaving a room, as if they were debutantes preparing for their first ball long before they could even spell ball. Working-class children, meanwhile, experienced a very different version of manners. Their rules were usually practical rather than ceremonial. Don't speak rudely to adults, don't waste food, don't interrupt work, and don't track mud into the house. But even they were taught the importance of visible respect, especially toward employers, church leaders, or wealthier families. Their manner training was less decorative but equally rooted in fear of judgment. A poorly mannered working-class child wasn't just an embarrassment. They could jeopardize family reputation, employment, or opportunity. In the end, the Victorian obsession with manners wasn't just about politeness. It was about control, structure, and the belief that visible refinement reflected inner virtue. A well-mannered child was a child who knew their place in the social hierarchy. A child who slipped out of line risked being labelled unruly, undisciplined, or morally questionable. To Victorian parents, that was unthinkable. Now that manners have taken their bow, your next chapter can flow into the absurdity of children's clothing. The stiff collars, scratchy fabrics, and miniature fashion torture devices that turned everyday dressing into a small-scale endurance trial, or transition into the expectations placed differently on boys versus girls in Victorian society. Either direction continues the journey into charming Victorian contradictions. Victorian clothing was less about comfort and more about character, or at least the Victorian belief that fabric could sculpt the moral integrity of a child as effectively as it shaped their silhouette. If you've ever complained about scratchy tags or stiff school uniforms, imagine an era where children were dressed like walking sculptures, bound in layers of wool, lace, buckles, and structural reinforcements designed to produce not warmth or style, but discipline. Victorians genuinely believed that clothing didn't just cover the body, it corrected it. In their eyes, a properly dressed child was a properly formed child, and a properly formed child was a future adult with virtues as rigid as their collars. Let's begin with the most eyebrow-lifting item: tiny corsets. Yes, corsets for children, even for very young children. The belief was simple and bizarre. A straight body produced a straight character. If adulthood required good posture, why not force it early? Girls were the primary targets of this logic, though boys were not entirely spared from posture devices. Many girls' corsets were meant not to create fashionable curves, that came later, but to encourage poise, stillness, and proper carriage. A slouching child was not merely physically misaligned, they were morally suspect. Victorian mothers tightened laces not out of cruelty, but because manuals told them that a child's self-discipline began with their rib cage. Boys had their own torment, stiff collars so starched they could probably slice bread. These collars extended upward like neck prisons, forcing boys to keep their heads perfectly upright. If a child dared look down too suddenly, The collar reminded them painfully to reconsider. The logic behind this? Looking downward encouraged introspection, melancholy, and moral decline. A stiff collar, therefore, protected the child from becoming a poet or something equally dangerous to Victorian sensibilities. Then came the fabrics. Victorians adored wool. Not soft wool, not gentle wool, thick, scratchy, skin-chafing wool, and they used it for everything. Winter coats, summer dresses, stockings, undergarments, even baby clothes. Wool was seen as wholesome, durable, and morally sturdy. The fact that it could make a child feel like they were wrapped in an itchy cocoon was dismissed as a necessary hardship. Comfort was decadent. It softened character, and so if a child sweated through a July afternoon in layers of wool, this was considered good for them, a form of physical and moral tempering. Summer breezes were unnecessary. Itchiness was virtue. Let's talk about layering, because Victorian layering wasn't just warm, it was architectural. Children routinely wore far more layers than modern adults would tolerate. A typical outfit might include a flannel chemise, a woolen petticoat, another petticoat, a cotton shift, a dress or tunic, stockings held up with garters, boots with multiple fastenings, a jacket or pinafore, and often a final layer for modesty. Victorian children didn't get dressed. They were assembled. The goal was to teach modesty and discipline by planting the idea that the body was always one layer away from mischief. Even babies weren't spared the layering logic. Infants were swaddled, wrapped, and tucked into outfits so thick they resembled ornate bundles of laundry with faces. Clothing was meant to restrain movement, creating calmness and producing a visually orderly child. The fact that many babies probably felt like simmering dumplings into summer didn't bother Victorian caregivers. If anything, a little discomfort assured them the system was working. Footwear was another arena of character formation. Shoes were often stiff, narrow, and unforgiving, designed not for running or playing, but for walking with dignity. Victorian children clacked around in boots that required effort, training, and occasionally a minor miracle to put on. The shoes did not bend. The children had to bend to the shoes. Parents believed this taught restraint and self-control, because nothing builds character like footwear that refuses to cooperate. Beyond physical constraint, clothing served as a visual language of discipline. A sharply dressed child was a symbol of parental virtue. If a child's clothes were crisp, clean, and aligned like military regalia, people assumed the household was orderly, moral, and respectable. If a child's collar sagged, or their stockings fell, or, heaven forbid, their hair became unruly, judgment rained down from neighbours like ash from a disapproving volcano. Parents didn't just dress their children for practicality, they dressed them for public inspection. The differences across class lines were striking. Wealthier families imposed elaborate clothing rituals on their children, insisting on pristine outfits that required constant maintenance. Working-class children, on the other hand, wore sturdier, more practical clothing. But even then, the idea of clothing as moral instruction persisted. A working-class child might wear fewer layers, but they still faced lectures if their hems tore or their boots became scuffed. Clothes were symbols of dignity, no matter one's income, and children were expected to honour them. Victorian children learned early that clothing was not optional, and certainly not expressive. It was duty. It was identity. It was armour. Dressing a child was seen as shaping not just their appearance, but their A properly dressed child was ready for the world. An improperly dressed one signalled a household on the brink of ruin. Parents armed their children with stiff collars, itchy underlayers, and corsets not out of cruelty, but because society insisted that only through discomfort could a child learn the importance of restraint. And yet, children being children, many found ways to rebel. After hours of being trussed up like decorative figurines, they escaped outdoors, tore holes in stockings, muddied pinafores, loosened collars, or kicked off their boots. Their small wild rebellions were often met with gasps of horror, cries of, "Your appearance, think of your appearance," and immediate attempts to restore order. But those fleeting moments, a loosened lace, a smudged cuff, were powerful reminders that beneath the mountain of fabric, a real child still existed, yearning to breathe and move freely. With Victorian fashion now buttoned, buckled, and laced into place, your next chapter can separate boys from girls, exploring how each was groomed for distinct roles, expectations, and futures. Or you can jump directly into the world of a young Victorian gentleman in training versus angelic Victorian daughters. Either direction opens the door to delightful contradictions and societal oddities. Victorian Britain didn't simply raise boys, manufactured future men with the same precision and anxiety used to maintain steam engines. A son wasn't just a child, he was an investment, a legacy, a walking promise of family reputation, and a miniature gentleman in continuous rehearsal for adulthood. His childhood wasn't designed for curiosity or whimsy, but for stoicism, discipline, and the careful cultivation of traits that Victorians believed defined a proper man: leadership, bravery, emotional restraint, and an alarming tolerance for discomfort. From the moment a boy could toddle, adults began shaping him into a pint-sized pillar of gentlemanly virtue. Stoicism came first. A Victorian boy was expected to handle physical and emotional discomfort with quiet resolve, whether it was a scraped knee, a lost toy, or the crushing disappointment of being told he wasn't old enough to accompany father to the important-looking gentleman's club down the street. Tears were an early target of correction. A boy who cried too easily was warned that softness threatened his future. "Be brave, my boy," adults commanded, as if bravery was something a child could simply switch on like a gas lamp. Leadership was another essential trait. Boys were groomed to lead younger siblings, household servants, and even playmates, whether or not they showed natural leadership talent. A Victorian boy could be the shyest creature alive, yet still be told he must take command of his peers during playtime. If he hesitated, adults nudged him forward like a tiny, reluctant general. The child might have preferred building imaginary castles in peace, but no, he must lead the siege. It wasn't about whether anyone wanted to be led. It was about reinforcing the belief that boys were destined for roles that required authority. A hesitant boy was a future adult who might accidentally hesitate in front of a tax form. Unthinkable. Bravery, too, became a daily test. Victorian boys were expected to interact with their environment as if every stick, puddle and hill were training grounds for valour. Climbing a tree? Good, but climb higher. Jumping a ditch? Excellent, but next time, jump a bigger one. Scraping your knee? That meant you were learning endurance. Even the games Victorian boys played reflected this obsession. Mock battles, adventures, and heroic rescues of imaginary comrades took centre stage. If a boy preferred quiet hobbies, adults often steered him toward activities that felt more vigorous. A boy reading novels quietly was encouraged to take up cricket instead. A boy enjoying solitude was reminded that isolation might soften the spirit. A future gentleman needed stamina, coordination, and a general sense of readiness for life's many metaphorical and literal hills to climb. Self-denial was yet another pillar of Victorian boyhood. The world, adults explained, was full of temptations, treats, leisure, comfort, and general fun, and a boy must learn early that indulgence leads to weakness. This was the era when parents praised sons for refusing sweets, applauded stoic tolerance of uncomfortable shoes, and celebrated early signs of manly restraint. A boy who quietly endured hunger or weather without complaint was treated like a young hero, even if he was simply trying to avoid scolding. You showed marvellous fortitude, adults might say about a child who sat still for hours in woolen clothing. Meanwhile, the boy himself wondered why being uncomfortable had suddenly become a moral victory. Work training entered a boy's life shockingly early. Even if his family was wealthy and he wouldn't work a day in childhood, he still trained for adulthood through miniature labour. Boys helped in the garden, tended fires, carried coal or ran errands, not because they needed to, but because hard tasks supposedly shaped character. Wealthier families invented tasks when necessary. giving their sons tiny duties such as polishing a specific shelf or managing a toy collection as if it were an office. The idea wasn't work itself, it was the discipline that accompanied it. A gentleman must know diligence, adults insisted, conveniently ignoring that many gentlemen did very little actual work. For boys in working-class families, the line between training and real labour wasn't so clear. Many boys joined the workforce early, as chimney sweeps, factory helpers, street vendors or apprentices. The expectation wasn't about cultivating gentlemanly virtues, it was about contributing to survival. But even in these households, the moral message was similar. A boy must work, endure, and prepare for the responsibilities of adulthood. Laziness was condemned, rest was suspicious. A working-class boy quickly learned that strength and toughness were essential not for reputation but for sheer survival. Across all social classes, boys were routinely reminded of the futures awaiting them. Wealthy boys were prepared for education, careers, property management, or professional roles. Middle-class boys were trained for respectability and steady employment. Working-class boys were groomed for resilience and hard physical work. Regardless of background, everyone agreed that boys should actively prepare for adulthood the way one prepares for an exam, early, repeatedly, and with constant supervision. All of this created a strange, exhausting paradox. Victorian boys were expected to grow into confident, capable men, yet their entire childhoods were controlled so tightly that spontaneous confidence barely had room to breathe. Their independence was rehearsed, not experienced. Their bravery was performed, not discovered. Their leadership was assigned, not chosen. And their emotional restraint was drilled into them long before they had words for what they felt. Still, boys did what children always do, they adapted. Some embraced the expectations, marching around parlours, pretending to be soldiers. Others resisted quietly, finding small sanctuaries of boyish joy between obligations, and many simply carried the lessons silently into adulthood, believing that the world truly required them to be as stoic and sturdy as their childhood training suggested. Now that the sons have been properly moulded into tiny gentlemen, your next chapter can step seamlessly into the world of Victorian daughters, exploring the equally intense but very different expectations placed upon girls, or transition into how outdoor play became another moral battlefield. Both paths lead deeper into the delightful contradictions of Victorian parenting. If Victorian boys were future gentlemen under construction, Victorian girls were treated like delicate prototypes of perfection, prototypes that had to be flawless or risk being labelled disappointments before they could even tie their own shoes. A daughter was expected to embody modesty, grace, purity, gentleness, and obedience at all times, as though she were auditioning for the role of most well-behaved child in the empire. Anything less, and society wasted no time whispering. Victorian parenting manuals didn't merely describe how to raise girls. They laid out a checklist for manufacturing miniature angels. Deviate from the list, and the result was considered a tragedy. Victorian girls were trained from infancy to be visibly modest, a concept that controlled everything from their posture to their clothing to how loudly they were allowed to breathe. The goal wasn't simply to behave well, it was to behave minutely. A good girl occupied space so quietly that no one ever questioned her presence. She didn't run, she didn't shout, she didn't jump or tumble or climb or swing or do anything that might cause her dress to lift even an inch. If she laughed too loudly, the adult stiffened. If she expressed excitement, someone whispered a reminder about decorum. Childhood enthusiasm was considered a dangerous substance. Girls learned early that the world approved of them only when they moved as lightly and gently as drifting feathers. Posture was everything. A crooked spine wasn't just a physical problem, it was a moral one. Girls were taught to sit with their backs straight, their shoulders relaxed but not too relaxed, their hands folded, their feet placed neatly together. Even the way a girl tilted her head mattered. A chin lifted too high suggested arrogance. A chin too low hinted at insecurity. The correct angle fell somewhere between delicate flower and humble future hostess. Girls practiced balancing books on their heads to achieve perfect alignment, turning posture correction into a daily ritual of endurance. If a book fell, it wasn't the book's fault, it was hers. But posture was only the beginning. A proper Victorian girl required domestic skills, and these skills were drilled into her long before she understood why she needed them. Domesticity was not just encouraged, it was expected with almost spiritual seriousness. A girl was trained to sew, mend, embroider, polish, arrange flowers, fold linens, and maintain her future household with quiet competence. Sewing drills were particularly relentless. Girls stitched, unstitched, and restitched until their fingers developed the kind of muscle memory pianists dream of. They practiced stitching lines so straight they could have doubled as architectural measurements. Mistakes were gently but firmly corrected because a girl's sewing was believed to reflect her discipline or lack thereof. These domestic duties taught more than practical skills. They taught submission. A core part of the Victorian female ideal. A good daughter was patient. A good daughter was compliant. A good daughter deferred to authority without question. Parents praised girls who were agreeable, gentle, and self-contained. Girls who displayed curiosity, assertiveness, or independent thinking often found themselves politely stifled. Such spirit, adults would say, their voices carrying the unmistakable undertone, and we will remove it. Independence in a girl was viewed like a weed in a manicured garden, wild, unwelcome, and best pulled early. On top of the domestic expectations came the relentless pressure of moral purity. Victorian girls were raised with the understanding that their reputations were as fragile as soap bubbles. One wrong step, one improper glance, one overly friendly conversation could burst everything. Girls were instructed to guard their behaviour with vigilance. They were lectured about virtue long before they understood the word. Even their thoughts were monitored through moral stories and cautionary tales about girls who strayed from propriety and met dramatic fates. In a Victorian household, purity wasn't simply a concept, it was a career. Because of this, girls lived with astonishing restrictions on their independence. They rarely walked alone. They rarely ran errands without supervision. They were seldom allowed to wander outdoors without a chaperone. Their entire world was carefully managed. Objects of curiosity, books, artworks, conversations, were filtered to ensure nothing inappropriate touched their imaginations. Even friendships were sometimes supervised to ensure no moral contamination occurred. A girl could feel as though she lived in an invisible cage, one built from affection, fear, and a deep societal paranoia that femininity must be protected at all costs. And yet, the contradictions were everywhere. While girls were kept sheltered, they were simultaneously trained for future roles that demanded extraordinary competence. A girl needed to manage a household, guide servants, raise children, entertain guests, and maintain dignity through every possible catastrophe. She was expected to become a miracle of domestic calm, but she was given almost no practice making decisions independently. Victorian parents raised girls to be responsible adults, while denying them the experiences that produce responsibility. It was a masterclass in paradox. Still, Victorian girls were not empty ornaments. They found small ways to push back, subtle rebellions stitched in quiet corners of their lives. A girl might sneak a novel beneath her embroidery, read by candlelight when she was supposed to be sleeping, or indulge in a quick forbidden twirl when no adults were watching. Some formed deep friendships, sharing secrets that defied the silence expected of them. Others explored their passions, writing, drawing, music, in stolen moments between chores and lessons. Despite the constraints, a spark always remained. But society judged girls harshly. A girl who excelled was praised as a perfect angel, the pride of her family. A girl who faltered became a disappointment. A girl who showed too much willpower was considered troublesome. A girl who showed too little was pitied. There was no middle ground. She was either everything or nothing, an impossible standard placed upon shoulders already burdened by lace, responsibility, and the weight of Victorian expectations. Now that sons and daughters have been shaped by the era's exhausting ideals, your next chapter can step into the strange moral tangle of Victorian outdoor play, where parents loved the idea of fresh air, but panicked when children actually enjoyed themselves, or move into the wild world of Victorian home remedies and health advice. Either path continues this wonderfully bizarre journey into historical parenting. Victorian parents loved outdoor play in theory. Nothing delighted them more than describing the benefits of fresh air, sunshine, and wholesome country breezes that supposedly strengthened children's lungs and stiffened their moral fibre. Doctors praised outdoor exercise as nature's tonic. Newspapers exalted it as necessary for vitality, and mothers nodded approvingly whenever a child expressed interest in being outside. But the moment that child actually stepped outside, panic. Genuine theatrical panic. A Victorian child was expected to go outside, but don't sweat, shout, smile, or breathe too enthusiastically. Outdoor play in the Victorian mind was a beautiful idea rendered intolerable upon contact with reality. Parents encouraged it with the same energy modern parents use to encourage creativity, right up until an actual mess appears. Children were told to romp but gently, explore but carefully, enjoy themselves but ideally without expressing visible joy. The first villain of outdoor play was the scraped knee, a catastrophe on par with losing a tooth or declaring war on France. Scratches weren't merely physical injuries, they were emblems of parental negligence. If a child returned home with torn stockings or a bruise, the household erupted into a melodrama. Adults gasped, servants whispered, doctors were summoned. How did this happen? They asked, as though the child had engaged in a duel instead of simply tripping over a rock. Victorian families treated a scraped knee with the solemnity of a public scandal. Children quickly learned that falling was unacceptable. Running too fast? Suspicious? Climbing anything higher than a daisy? Reckless. Even laughing too vigorously could raise concerns that the child was overexerting. Then came germs, those invisible agents of doom. Victorians didn't fully understand them, but they feared them with impressive creativity. Outdoor air was praised for its purity, but the outdoors themselves? Filthy. Soil was alive with dangerous vapours. Ponds harboured unwholesome influences. Grass could conceal illness-bearing miasma. Even trees were sometimes suspected of harbouring mysterious ailments in their bark. Children were encouraged to play outside but not touch anything. A Victorian child at play resembled a skittish bird hopping across a picnic blanket, perpetually warned, don't get too close to nature. Nature is dangerous. Adults loved seeing children stroll through gardens, stroll, not run. Running was a sign of wildness, a close relative of chaos. A running child might fall, sweat, breathe heavily, or worst of all, develop a sense of freedom. Victorians feared wildness almost as much as illness. Every child was expected to enjoy nature with the calm composure of a poet in a delicate watercolour painting, not the chaotic enthusiasm of an actual child discovering a beetle for the first time. A child shrieking with delight? Restore order immediately. A child chasing pigeons? Moral danger? A child climbing a tree? Practically a renegade. Come down at once, adults cried, as if the child had climbed into the rigging of a pirate ship. But nothing terrified Victorian parents more than imagination. Specifically, too much imagination. Outdoor spaces gave children ideas, and ideas were risky. A stick could become a sword. A puddle could become a sea. A fallen log might become a dragon or a cave, or something else unacceptable. Mind your thoughts, adults warned, as if thoughts were prone to escaping like unruly cats. Imaginative play risked encouraging independence, creativity, and unpredictability, all traits Victorian society preferred to restrain. A child who pretended too freely might grow up with undesirable qualities such as ambition or independent thinking. Victorian parenting manuals walked a tightrope between encouraging outdoor play and fearing it. One might advise, allow the child daily access to fresh air. that their body may grow strong, immediately followed by, ensure they avoid undue exertion, rambunctious play, noisy company, sudden movements, damp ground, chills, and all manner of outdoor hazards. In other words, let the child outside, but don't let nature touch them. Wealthy families perfected this contradictory approach with carefully manicured gardens designed to look wild while being extremely safe. Smooth lawns, pruned hedges, tame flower beds, gardens curated to provide the illusion of nature without any of its unpredictable elements. A child could walk prettily among roses, but never near the stables. They could admire ponds, but never toss stones into them. They could explore woodland paths, which were typically straight gravel walkways bordered by sternly trained shrubbery. These gardens were nature in captivity, designed for children who were encouraged to appreciate but never interact with the world. Working-class children, of course, experienced a different reality. The outdoors was where they played, because the indoors were crowded, cramped, or entirely unavailable. Their play was loud, physical, and often unsupervised. They climbed, ran, chased each other, balanced on fences, dug in mud, and returned home looking like they had travelled through 6 wars and a minor landslide. To Victorian moralists, this was horrifying. To the children, it was daily life. Outdoor play wasn't a curated health treatment. It was the only space where they could breathe without restriction. Still, even working-class children encountered outdoor contradictions. They were warned not to venture too far, not to climb too high, not to get too dirty, not to linger in alleyways, yards, or near water. Adults wanted them outdoors, but in the safest, most controlled version of outdoors possible, which was usually a yard the size of a tablecloth. And underlying all these anxieties was a greater Victorian fear, loss of control. Outdoors, children could act freely. They could explore without permission. They could encounter unexpected sights or ideas. They might meet other children, animals, strangers, or situations that parents couldn't curate. The outdoors was unpredictable, and unpredictability was Victorian enemy number 1. So parents tried to balance their desire for healthy children with their obsession with order, creating an outdoor play environment full of rules so elaborate that fun itself became suspicious. Yet, despite all these restrictions, children still managed to be children. They found ways to outrun the rules, literally. A child would sneak a running sprint before an adult noticed. They'd pocket interesting rocks or insects. They'd climb trees when no one was looking or invent elaborate games in the forbidden wild parts of gardens. Even within the Victorian cage of propriety, childhood stubbornly found cracks to slip through. With the paradox of outdoor play explored, the next chapter can transition naturally into the world of strange Victorian medical advice, from tonics to syrups to dubious cures, or you can dive into the superstition-laden parenting practices that shaped daily life. Each direction opens another window into this wonderfully peculiar era. If Victorian parenting had a motto, it would have been, if it tastes disgusting, burns slightly, or smells like a chemistry experiment gone rogue, it must be good for the child. Victorian medical advice didn't simply miss the mark. It sprinted past the mark, leapt over a fence, and landed in a field of wild guesses delivered with the confidence of absolute certainty. Children were dosed, rubbed, wrapped, drenched, and occasionally frightened into health with remedies that today would land a person on several watch lists. Let's begin with the undisputed king of Victorian cures, cod liver oil. Parents believed it could fix everything. Weak bones, pale skin, slow growth, gloomy moods, and any physical ailment short of spontaneous combustion. Doctors recommended spoonfuls daily, sometimes multiple times a day. The oil smelled like despair and tasted like the ocean had gone rancid and decided to take revenge. Children gagged, fought, wailed, and made dramatic faces, but none of it mattered. Cod liver oil was considered the holy elixir of childhood. A child refusing their dose wasn't merely stubborn, they were flirting with ruin. Adults stood over them with the solemnity of priests administering a sacred rite, convinced that the foul liquid pouring down their throats was as essential as air. Then there were mustard plasters, the Victorian equivalent of sticking a spicy sandwich spread on your chest and calling it medicinal. Parents applied mustard pastes to children's skin for coughs, fevers, congestion, sore throats, melancholy, and the vague diagnosis of weak nerves. The plasters were supposed to draw out illness, but mostly they drew out screams. If left on too long, which happened often, they burned the skin, leaving patches of redness that Victorians mistook for signs of success. "Ah, yes," a parent might say as their child clutched their chest in agony. "The body is responding beautifully." No one questioned why a medicine that caused minor burns was considered soothing. Leeches also made a regular appearance in the Victorian medicine cabinet. For everything from headaches to swelling to disorderly humours, parents confidently applied these helpful little vampires to their children's skin. It didn't matter whether the ailment was mild or severe, leeches were universal. A child with a fever, apply leeches. A child with a rash, more leeches. A child who felt faint, quick, bring the leeches. Victorian children must have lived in constant dread that any complaint, "I feel tired, my stomach hurts, I think I saw a scary shadow," would result in someone saying, "Let us drain your blood for balance." The idea that a weakened child could be improved by removing more blood somehow seemed perfectly logical to adults. But the award for worst medical idea goes to the mercury mixtures given to children to purify the system. Mercury and actual mercury appeared in tonics, ointments, pills and powders marketed as miracle cures. It was recommended for everything from constipation to sluggishness to tooth pain. Victorian parents handed their children mercury as casually as modern parents hand out vitamins. Unfortunately, mercury was quietly turning their insides into hazardous waste zones. Symptoms like trembling hands, mood swings, and tooth loss were often attributed to other causes. "The child seems irritable," a mother might say while spooning more mercury mixture, never realising it was the Victorian equivalent of poisoning your kid with a thermometer. Then came the wide world of nerve tonics, mysterious concoctions advertised with extravagant claims, restoring vitality, calming agitation, stimulating appetite, strengthening delicate constitutions, and balancing the nerves. The ingredients were rarely listed, partly because many of them were alcohol. Not mild alcohol, strong, full-bodied alcohol. A child who took their nerve tonic might go from wailing to pleasantly dazed within minutes, and Victorians would nod approvingly, "See, it works wonders." These tonics weren't medicines, they were unintentional cocktails turning fussy children into relaxed, wobbly versions of themselves. Some tonics even included stimulants to perk children up, leading to the terrifying combination of a sugar eye and a mild hangover in someone too small to understand either. But nothing rivals the darkest Victorian remedy of all, opium syrups for teething. Yes, opium, actual narcotic-laced syrups marketed directly to parents who were desperate for their teething babies to sleep. The products had charming names like Mother's Helper, Soothing Syrup, and Infant's Quietness, as though they were selling lullabies in a bottle instead of pharmaceuticals that would knock out a grown adult. These syrups guaranteed hours of silent slumber, which made Victorian parents believe they were miracles. They weren't. They were tranquilizers with pretty labels. Doctors warned occasionally about their potency, but the warnings were vague and inconsistent, so most parents kept dosing their babies. A teething child was irritable, give them opium. A crying child was restless, give them opium. A child who wouldn't nap, give them opium. The practice was so widespread that an entire generation of Victorian infants probably drifted through teething in a soft narcotic haze. Victorians asked themselves, "Why is my child so calm?" and never paused long enough to consider the answer. Because their gums hurt and we accidentally gave them something stronger than half the liquor cabinet. Beyond these notorious cures were countless smaller, stranger ones. Goose fat rubbed on chests, vinegar hair rinses to prevent headaches, roasted onions placed in socks to cure colds, and herbal teas so bitter they could strip paint. Victorian homes became laboratories of experimentation, fueled by fear, hope, and the complete absence of modern medical standards. The parents meant well, they genuinely wanted their children to thrive, but medicine at the time was equal parts guesswork and enthusiastic folklore. And yet, despite all these remedies, children endured. They survived the cod liver oil, lived through the mustard burns, outlasted the leeches, and somehow grew up despite enough mercury exposure to qualify as walking thermometers. Their resilience was not a triumph of Victorian medicine, it was a triumph of childhood. Now that the chaotic world of Victorian cures has been explored, your next chapter can glide naturally into the superstitions that shaped parenting, or move towards the emotional landscape of servants raising children, whichever path best carries your narrative forward into the next curious corner of Victorian life. Victorian parenting wasn't guided solely by manuals, moral lectures, and endless rules. It was also shaped by a swirling fog of superstition, inherited folklore, whispered warnings, and a surprising amount of magical thinking. Beneath all the lace-trimmed logic of the era lived a lively undercurrent of omens, charms, fortune-telling rituals, and old wives' tales passed down with the certainty of scientific fact. Victorians loved to present themselves as rational and modern, but when it came to raising children, they often reverted to beliefs so mystical they made fairy tales look like instruction manuals. Superstition crept into the nursery from the moment a baby was born. One of the first tasks for a new mother wasn't just feeding or swaddling, it was protecting the child from omens. A bird tapping on a window meant trouble. A mirror in the nursery could capture the child's spirit if they looked into it too young. A falling picture foretold illness. Even the direction the baby first sneezed was interpreted as a sign of future temperament. To the left hinted at mischief, to the right suggested eventual virtue. Parents watched their infants like fortune tellers examining tea leaves, searching for cosmic signals hidden in ordinary moments. Then there were the teething rituals, which often sounded less like childcare and more like medieval quests. Victorians feared teething almost as much as they feared drafts. They believed it could trigger fever, delirium, fits, or even death. So they turned to charms, small strange objects believed to soothe or shield the child. Some hung coral necklaces around infants' necks, trusting the red branches to protect against evil. Others gave babies wolf teeth, believing the ferocity of the animal would lend the child strength. Some parents even used lucky stones, smooth pebbles rubbed on the gums to soothe pain. No one questioned how stones, wolf teeth, or ocean minerals had become teething tools. The logic lay buried in centuries of half-remembered folklore. Even clothing carried superstitious meaning. Babies often wore protective amulets sewn discreetly into their petticoats. Tiny silver coins, pieces of ribbon blessed by someone important, sprigs of dried herbs, or charms shaped like fists, hearts, or crescents. These were meant to ward off the evil eye, a gaze believed capable of causing harm through envy or malice. A particularly adorable baby might be kept indoors for weeks so strangers couldn't admire them too strongly, which, of course, might curse them. Victorians managed to be terrified simultaneously of germs, drafts, and compliments, a remarkable trifecta. Superstition also guided daily decision-making. Parents consulted almanacs to determine auspicious days for haircuts, vaccinations, or simply taking the baby into town. If a thunderstorm struck, children were rushed indoors not just for safety from lightning, but to prevent spirit interference. If the family cat jumped into the crib, alarms went off. The animal might steal the child's breath or bring bad luck. Some parents placed iron objects, keys, scissors, even horseshoes under the mattress to repel malevolent forces. Others tied red ribbons around cradles to deflect unwanted magic. Victorian nurseries sometimes resembled charm shops. Fortune-telling was not confined to carnival tents. It seeped quietly into everyday parenting. Mothers might interpret a child's palm lines while the baby slept, searching for signs of future success or misfortune. A girl born with a small birthmark was predicted to be lucky. A boy who flexed his fingers early was said to have a strong will and needed extra discipline. Drop a child's rattle by accident, a sign they would be clumsy, find a feather in the crib, a sign of angelic protection. Parents used these tiny predictions to justify parenting choices. Superstition functioned like a Victorian co-parent, eccentric, unreliable, but always loud. Even older children were not spared. They grew up hearing moral warnings disguised as magic, admonitions designed to frighten them into obedience. If you play near the well, a water spirit may take you. If you lie, the devil will mark your tongue. If you wander after sunset, ghosts may follow you home. None of these warnings addressed practical safety. Instead, they conjured supernatural threats with impressive creativity. Victorian adults used folklore the way modern parents use screen time limits. As a tool for control, children learned to fear shadows, forests, crossroads, and even their own imaginations. But the most persistent superstition was the belief in bad influences. Victorians spoke of bad influences almost like wandering spirits that could latch onto a child at a moment's notice. A child who misbehaved must have been exposed to someone improper. A child who asked too many questions must have read something unsuitable. A child who expressed strong emotions, anger, excitement, curiosity, was said to have picked up vulgar habits from outsiders. Parents vigilantly monitored friendships, neighbours, relatives, books, and even the family servants, fearful that invisible moral contamination could slip into the household. Superstition and social anxiety intertwined until it was difficult to tell where one ended and the other began. Ironically, many of these superstitions coexisted with an outward devotion to science and modernity. Victorians adored technological progress, trains, telegraphs, gas lamps, yet still hung horseshoes over nursery doors. Doctors wrote treatises on physiology while warning families to avoid walking under ladders. Parents praised discipline and rationality while interpreting the shape of spilled milk for hidden meanings. The contradiction was not hypocrisy, it was the nature of the age, a period straddling tradition and transformation, logic and folklore, caution and curiosity. And amidst all this magical thinking, children did what children always do. They listened, absorbed, trembled a little, and then grew up remembering the strangest stories their parents ever told. Some superstitions traumatized them. Some comforted them. Others became family jokes passed down to future generations. Victorian superstition, for all its oddity, also created a shared language of storytelling, a way for families to explain the world's mysteries long before science provided better answers. With superstition explored, your next chapter can shift into the household itself, specifically the world of the servants who raised Victorian children, and the confusing double standard of love, duty, and hierarchy, or move into the era's obsession with character-shaping lessons. Either path will deepen this remarkable portrait of Victorian childhood. If Victorian sons were miniature gentlemen, and Victorian daughters miniature angels, then Victorian parents were, often, nowhere in sight. In wealthy households, children grew up surrounded not by their mothers and fathers, but by an entire ecosystem of servants whose job was to raise, supervise, discipline, entertain, educate, and occasionally calm the emotional storms of their young charges. These children existed in a strange layered universe where they were adored, managed, corrected, and comforted, all by people who technically outranked them in affection, but not in hierarchy. The result? An upbringing defined by physical care, minimal parental presence, and emotional distance so wide you could ride a horse through it. Victorian parents of means embraced an ideology that children were important but not necessarily to be interacted with. A respectable mother showed love by overseeing the nursery budget, not by sitting on the floor building blocks. A father demonstrated devotion by choosing the right nanny, not by learning his child's favourite toy. Parenting was understood as managerial work. Supervise from afar, visit occasionally, and assume everything was fine unless informed otherwise. Children were to be cherished in theory, while remaining largely invisible in practice. Enter the true architects of childhood, the nanny and the nurse. In wealthy homes, the nanny ruled the nursery like a small, firm monarch whose kingdom lay upstairs far from the grand drawing rooms below. She set schedules, determined when meals were served, enforced rules, and interpreted the child's every sniffle, habit and tantrum. A Victorian nanny often spent more waking hours with a child than either parent did in a week. She knew the child's fears, preferences, and daily routines with a precision that made her the household's unofficial expert in everything under 3 feet tall. The nanny's authority was absolute within her domain. Even the parents deferred to her judgment, especially when it came to the rituals of feeding, bathing, or discipline. Mothers who ventured into the nursery often felt like guests in a foreign land, tolerated, politely guided, and promptly corrected if they attempted anything contrary to nanny protocol. Fathers ventured upstairs even less frequently. Entering the nursery felt improper, like entering a backstage area where the performance of childhood was carefully curated by the staff. For infants and toddlers, the nursemaid or wet nurse frequently served as the true primary caregiver. In many wealthy families, breastfeeding was considered inconvenient, unfashionable, or simply unnecessary. Why nurse when someone else could do it? Babies formed their earliest attachments to women who were not their mothers, women who soothed their cries, rocked them to sleep, cleaned their spills, and heard their first babbled attempts at speech. As children grew, the next figure entered the household hierarchy, the governess, a woman educated enough to teach but not privileged enough to participate in the family's social life. She occupied a strange in-between world, above the servants but below the family, and spent her days shaping young minds through reading lessons, geography drills, French pronunciation, piano practice, and moral instruction. The governess often knew a child's intellectual habits better than the mother did. She recognized when a boy was struggling with arithmetic or when a girl's hand trembled from too many hours practicing pen strokes. Yet she remained socially isolated, eating meals alone and living in quiet limbo. For the children, this created a confusing emotional landscape. On one hand, they loved their caregivers deeply. How could they not? These women bandaged their knees, held them during nightmares, listened to their fears, and taught them everything from tying shoes to reciting poetry. On the other hand, Victorian society demanded that servants maintain professionalism, meaning affection was often disguised, rationed, or suppressed. A nanny might adore her charge but correct them sharply in the next breath, maintaining the expected distance. A governess might care deeply for her pupils but never let herself grow too attached, knowing she could be dismissed at any moment. And then there was the emotional gap between children and their parents. Many Victorian children saw their mothers briefly in the morning, or for a pre-bedtime visit, a ritual known as descending to the nursery. Fathers often made fewer appearances, usually limited to a weekly inspection or a formal request to present the children. These meetings resembled social appointments rather than familial bonding. A quick display of good posture, polite greetings, perhaps a recited poem. The parent expressed pride, the child expressed politeness, and then everyone returned to their assigned worlds. This distance wasn't rooted in coldness, it was simply the norm. Victorian parents believed they were preparing their children for life in a structured, hierarchical society. Emotionally reserved households produced emotionally reserved adults. And Victorians viewed emotional reserve as a virtue. Affection, meanwhile, was a luxury that didn't fit neatly into the strict architecture of class and propriety. Parents worried that too much fondness might spoil a child, disrupt discipline, or undermine the careful work of the servants who actually raised them. Yet the children, perceptive as they were, often felt the gap. Diaries from the period reveal quiet longings, boys who wished their fathers would play with them, girls who wished their mothers would hold them, children who treasured rare moments of parental softness like diamonds tucked away in their hearts. Some formed intense attachments to their nannies, treating them as surrogate mothers, only to experience heartbreak when those women were dismissed or replaced. A new nanny meant a new emotional centre, and another potential loss. Working-class families did not have this divide. Their children spent their days under the same roof, often in the same room, as their parents. But wealthy children lived in separate worlds within the same house. Adults downstairs, children upstairs, connected more by architecture than by intimacy. And yet, despite the emotional ache woven through upper-class childhood, many of these children remembered their nannies and governesses with profound affection. They wrote about them later in life as the anchors of their early years, the ones who taught them compassion, protected them from fear, and gave them stability amidst the cold marble of Victorian propriety. With the world of servant-raised children explored, your next chapter can transition into the Victorian obsession with shaping children into moral paragons, or move towards the terrifying world of public displays, recitations, and social performance expected of young Victorians. Either direction opens another door into this complex, fascinating era. If wealthy Victorian parents fretted about posture, nap schedules, and the emotional symbolism of spoon placement, working-class parents lived in a completely different universe, a world where survival wasn't a concept but a daily negotiation. Their parenting style wasn't shaped by etiquette manuals, doctors' circular contradictions, or starched expectations. It was shaped by factory whistles, cramped housing, polluted streets, and the brutal math of trying to feed a family on wages that barely covered rent. Victorian working-class parenting wasn't about raising miniature angels or miniature gentlemen. It was about keeping children alive, and sometimes that alone was a miracle. A working-class home didn't have nurseries, nannies, or carefully curated toy rooms. It had crowded rooms, often with multiple families under one roof. Tenement housing meant neighbours separated by only thin walls and thinner patients. A single room might serve as bedroom, kitchen, dining space and living area. Infants slept wherever there was space, in shared beds, makeshift cradles, or sometimes inside drawers lined with old fabric. Parents did their best, but privacy was non-existent and comfort was a luxury. Industrial life forced working-class parents to become masters of improvisation. Days began early, often before dawn, because factories, mines, and workshops demanded punctuality. Parents who worked 12-hour shifts had no choice but to leave older children in charge of younger ones, creating childhood caretakers barely out of childhood themselves. The Victorian ideal of constant supervision simply wasn't possible. For many working-class kids, learning to take care of siblings was a duty, not an optional life skill. Street safety was a constant worry, and for good reason. Victorian streets were chaotic landscapes of horse-drawn carts, coal smoke, sewage, crowds, and noise. Children played in alleys, stairwells, rubbish heaps, and sooty courtyards, watched by neighbours who kept an informal but inconsistent eye on them. A child might spend hours outside dodging carts and slipping through narrow passages because indoors was too cramped to move. Victorian parents didn't encourage outdoor play for health. They accepted outdoor play because there was literally nowhere else to put the children. But the biggest difference between working class and wealthy childhoods was this. Working class children often had to work, not in the learn responsibility through chores sense, not in the practice being a leader sense. Actual wage-earning labour. Children as young as 5 or 6 helped their families survive by working in factories, mines, mills, docks, markets, farms, or as street vendors. A child might sell flowers, sweep chimneys, carry loads, or run errands for a shopkeeper. Some worked long hours in dangerous environments where machinery whirred, sparks flew, and supervision was minimal. Victorian society called these jobs opportunities. Modern society calls them violations. Parents didn't send their children to work because they were indifferent. They sent them because they had no other option. A factory wage could mean the difference between eating and not eating. A child who brought home even a few pennies contributed to rent, fuel and food. If parents had a choice, they would have protected their children from harsh labour. But choices were scarce and survival was relentless. Children adapted, as children do. They learned quickly, not out of curiosity, but necessity. They memorized the rhythms of factory machines to avoid injury. They watched older kids to learn street routes, safe hiding spots, and the best times to sell goods. They developed toughness not because it was admired, but because their lives demanded it. A scraped knee wasn't a crisis. It was a daily occurrence. A cough wasn't alarming unless it worsened. A minor injury didn't prompt a doctor's visit. It prompted the question, "Can you still go to work tomorrow?" Education existed, but it competed with survival. Some working-class children attended school when they could, but many had spotty attendance or none at all. Schooling was a dream, not an expectation. Parents valued literacy and knowledge. They knew education could open doors, but the family needed food first. Even children who went to school often worked before or after class, squeezing education between exhaustion and obligation. Moral upbringing in working-class families looked very different from the strict etiquette of upper-class households. Instead of posture drills, children learned about loyalty, resourcefulness, and perseverance. Instead of being told to suppress emotions, they often learned to manage conflict loudly and directly, because that was the only way to be heard in a noisy world. Instead of being insulated from hardship, they saw it daily: illness, injury, hunger, and sometimes death. These experiences didn't make them mini-adults, in the performative Victorian sense. They made them survivors. Despite the hardships, working-class families were often fiercely close-knit. Emotional warmth flourished where rules could not. Parents showed affection in ways that weren't polite or polished, but genuine. Sharing food, telling stories by firelight, singing songs, comforting children after long days, or squeezing into crowded beds to stay warm. What wealthier parents outsourced to servants, working-class parents did themselves when exhaustion allowed. Their homes might have been cramped and chaotic, but they were filled with the raw, unfiltered humanity that upper-class homes often lacked. Community also played a vital role. Neighbours watched each other's children, shared what they could, and intervened when trouble brewed. A child might be soldiered by multiple adults on the same street, but they would also be fed by multiple households if needed. Parent figures multiplied because life demanded collective care. For all its hardships, working-class childhood wasn't devoid of joy. Children found ways to turn their harsh surroundings into playgrounds, skipping stones in puddles, playing tag in alleys, inventing games with scraps, chasing each other through markets, or listening to songs sung by street musicians. Their laughter echoed in places where adults rarely lingered, turning soot-blackened streets into temporary stages of freedom. Working-class parenting was a testament to resilience. It wasn't polished, elegant, or guided by manuals. It was shaped by labour, necessity, improvisation, and fierce love expressed through survival. These parents didn't raise idealised Victorian children. They raised children who could endure, adapt, and find brightness in a world that often offered very little. With class realities now uncovered, your next chapter can dive into the Victorian obsession with public performance, the recitations, piano pieces, polite parading, and constant pressure to show off children in social settings, or move into the era's bizarre farewell rituals as children aged into adults. Either path continues the intricate mosaic of Victorian parenting. Looking back at Victorian parenting is like opening a beautifully decorated box, only to discover it's filled with anxiety, superstition, and uncomfortable children wearing 17 layers of wool. And yet, strangely, frustratingly, the Victorian era didn't entirely disappear. Its fingerprints linger in modern-day parenting in ways we don't always notice. In fact, Victorian parenting walked so modern helicopter parenting could run directly into a wall. To understand why Victorian parenting feels so bizarre now, we have to remember that Victorians didn't even believe in childhood the way we do today. Childhood wasn't considered a unique developmental stage deserving special treatment. It was seen as a preparatory phase, a moral boot camp for adulthood. This mindset created all the contradictions: strict rules layered over superstition, physical discomfort framed as character building, emotional suppression disguised as refinement, and bizarre health remedies marketed as science. Everything served a purpose, just not a purpose that aligns with modern ideas about child development. Today we laugh at the image of a stiff-collared, stone-faced child balancing books on their head. But Victorian parents saw those books as essential tools for sculpting future adults. The idea that children should be obedient, graceful, modest, and quietly well-behaved didn't vanish with the corsets. If anything, pieces of it slipped quietly into the 20th century, like uninvited guests refusing to leave the party. Early 20th century schooling still embraced strict posture. Mid-century households still emphasize good manners as signs of proper upbringing. Even the belief that emotional expression was dangerous persisted well into the 50s, when phrases like boys don't cry and good girls don't make a fuss still echoed through bedrooms and classrooms. Victorian parenting wasn't simply erased, it dissolved into the cultural background, like wallpaper you forget is there, until one day you realise it's shaped your entire aesthetic. Some remnants are surprisingly stubborn. Consider the modern obsession with productive kids. Victorian mothers demanded that their children practice piano, handwriting, sewing, posture and polite conversation until they practically rattled with discipline. Modern parents replace sewing drills with violin lessons, posture with sports teams, and recitations with STEM enrichment programs. But the instinct is familiar. Victorian parents feared idle hands. Modern parents fear wasted potential. And what about the great Victorian paradoxes? The fear of fresh air and the obsession with fresh air. The encouragement of play paired with the terror of play. The desire for independent children who never acted independently. Modern parenting didn't copy these contradictions, but it inadvertently reinvented them. We encourage creativity but panic when it gets messy. We champion independence while tracking our kids with apps. We urge free play but maintain a firm list of rules about where, when, how, and with whom it occurs. Victorian contradictions produce stiff, anxious children. Modern contradictions produce children who can code in 3 languages, but need a YouTube tutorial for tying their shoes. Not everything survived, of course, thank goodness. Mustard plasters, leeches, and opium syrups quietly shuffled into the museum of bad ideas. So did fear-based cautionary tales about water spirits and chimney ghosts. Few parents today lecture their children about drafts, unless they live with an elderly relative. And the concept of dressing children in woolen layers year-round faded as soon as people realised summer heat is not a moral test of endurance. But the biggest shift, the revolution that truly redefined childhood, came in the 20th century when psychology entered the parenting world. Suddenly children weren't tiny adults or moral projects. They were developing human beings with emotional needs, cognitive stages, and rights. Childhood became a distinct protected phase of life. Parents were told to comfort crying babies instead of ignoring them. Hugs became therapeutic instead of shameful. Play was recognised as essential to brain development rather than a risky flirtation with chaos. Paediatricians replaced fortune tellers. Science replaced superstition. And for the first time in Western history, children were encouraged not just to behave, but to feel. This shift didn't happen overnight. The early 1900s still clung to stiff discipline. But by the mid-century, schools softened, families grew more emotionally expressive, and child welfare became a national conversation. By the 70s and 80s, parenting books urged connection rather than suppression. The Victorian parenting manual had finally been tossed into the fire, where it probably belonged all along, and yet, in the quiet corners of modern parenting, Victorian ghosts linger. When a parent frets about a child's future because they fidget too much, a Victorian nanny nods in approval. When a mother worries her child isn't polite enough, echoes of drawing room etiquette ripple through time. When fathers tell sons to be strong, remnants of Victorian stoicism peek through. When families debate screen time like it's a moral failing, they unknowingly revive Victorian anxieties about frivolity and corrupting influences. Victorian parenting was a mix of earnest love, deep fear, and cultural pressure, a cocktail so potent that some of its ingredients lasted generations. But the modern world eventually rewrote childhood from the ground up. We now champion individuality, emotional intelligence, creativity, and mental health. Children are no longer expected to mimic adults. They're encouraged to become themselves. And while the pendulum sometimes swings too far, from allowing no independence to allowing none, the direction is undeniable. Children today are finally viewed as people, not projects. So, what survived? Manners, discipline, structure, and the idea that childhood needs guidance. What disappeared? Most of the fear, all of the opium, and thankfully the corsets. What did we gain? A world where children can laugh, learn, stumble, explore and grow without the crushing weight of Victorian expectations. A world where childhood is allowed to be childhood, chaotic, curious, messy, emotional, vibrant and beautifully alive. And if anything about modern parenting ever feels absurd, overwhelming, contradictory or anxiety-inducing, remember this. At least no one is rubbing mustard on your chest or analysing the moral implications of your sneeze. Victorian parenting may make no sense today, but it makes perfect sense as a historical cautionary tale. A reminder that love without understanding becomes control and fear disguised as wisdom becomes superstition.